It was a bright, cold morning in New York City, the kind of morning where the bustling streets of Manhattan never seemed to pause. The city was alive with its usual chaos. Taxis honking, crowds moving in every direction, and the hum of the subway beneath the ground. However, today, something extraordinary was about to happen. A moment that would stop this city in its tracks. Donald Trump, former president, real estate mogul, and one of the most recognized names in the world, was cruising through the streets in his motorcade. Surrounded by a fleet of black SUVs, flashing lights, and a team of Secret Service agents, the convoy looked every bit as powerful and untouchable as the man it was escorting. His day was supposed to be just another set of meetings and appearances, filled with the usual handshakes and photo ops. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? But as the motorcade turned a corner onto a narrow street, something unusual caught Trump's attention. His eyes darted to the sidewalk where a figure sat hunched, surrounded by the busy city, but clearly existing in a world apart from it. A woman, possibly in her late 40s, with tangled hair and clothes worn thin by time, sat cross-legged on the cold concrete. She was holding a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. Please, God bless." For a brief moment, it was as if the entire world around Trump went silent. The noise of the city, the chatter of his aides in the car, all faded. He stared at her, her weathered face imprinted with exhaustion, a look that was all too familiar to him now. A look of someone who had given up, but still clung to some fragile hope. The convoy sped past her, but something stopped Trump from following the usual protocol. Instead of continuing on his way to the next meeting, he reached for the door handle, his fingers lingering for a split second before pulling it open. The driver's startled look met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Trump, we need to keep moving. We're already late," his bodyguard warned, his voice sharp with concern. Trump didn't respond immediately. He was still watching the woman, now lowering her gaze as she stared at the ground. His mind raced for a moment. His entire life had been one of power, control, and never showing weakness. But there was something about this moment that unsettled him, something that made him feel responsible. Without saying another word, Trump turned to his bodyguard. "Stop the motorcade," he said, his voice steady, but firm. "What?" the bodyguard asked, shocked. "Stop the motorcade, now," Trump repeated. There was a brief silence, followed by the soft hum of the motorcade slowing to a stop. The agent's voice crackled in his ear, confirming they were halting traffic. The convoy remained motionless, in the eyes of everyone around them. Police officers, pedestrians, photographers, shifted toward the man who had just made a decision that no one expected. Donald Trump, a man who had spent decades dodging questions about homelessness and poverty, had just decided to make a stand in the most unexpected of ways. As Trump stepped out of the vehicle, the cold air hit his face like a slap, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive. There was no crowd of people cheering, no reporters shouting questions, no cameras trained on him. Just him and the woman. One of the many who had fallen through the cracks of the system he had spent so much of his life navigating. His security team, of course, followed closely behind, unsure of what their next move should be. They'd been trained for everything from assassination attempts to protests, but never something like this. Trump walked toward the woman cautiously, his black suit sharp against the gritty backdrop of the street. The woman didn't seem to notice him at first, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her. But when he was only a few feet away, she slowly looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Hello," Trump said, his voice surprisingly soft for someone who was used to commanding rooms. "What's your name?" The woman blinked, clearly thrown off by the question. Most people who passed by her in the streets didn't stop long enough to ask her name, let alone engage in conversation. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether she should answer him. "Sarah," she said quietly, her voice cracking slightly. "Sarah," Trump repeated, as if the name itself carried some weight. "I'm Donald Trump." He paused, watching her closely. "I just wanted to ask you, how are you doing?" It was a simple question, but in that moment, it felt profound. The woman's eyes flickered with a mix of disbelief and suspicion. How am I doing? She repeated, almost as if trying to understand the meaning of his words. I'm surviving, I guess. Trump nodded, but instead of offering empty words of sympathy, he took a step closer. He had no idea what had drawn him here, why he felt the need to stop in the middle of a busy street. But somehow, talking to Sarah felt like the most important thing he'd done all day. I know this may seem strange, Trump said after a long pause, but I wanted to hear your story. If you're willing to share it, of course. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. She was used to people ignoring her, or worse, treating her like a nuisance. But something about the way Trump looked at her, curious, not dismissive, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, someone cared. Okay, she said finally. I'll tell you. But it's not going to be pretty. Trump's eyes softened. He had heard plenty of difficult stories throughout his life. After all, he had spent years in the business world, a world where money could fix most things. But this was different. This was real life, unpolished and raw. For the first time in years, he felt something deep inside him stir, a feeling he had long forgotten, empathy. I'm listening, he said, stepping a little closer, as the sounds of the city continued to swirl around them. This was the moment that would change everything. A man of immense power, who had shaped his life around wealth, control, and winning, had just made a choice to connect with someone who had none of those things. But neither of them knew it yet. That choice would set them both on a journey neither could have imagined. And as Trump stood there, listening to Sarah's story, he had no idea that this simple act would lead him into a world of hardship, change, and self-discovery, a world where his life would never be the same. The story was just beginning. Donald Trump had built an empire, one of skyscrapers, golf courses, and high-profile TV shows. To the world, he was a titan, a man who made deals, called the shots, and never showed weakness. His name was synonymous with wealth, success, and influence. But beneath that larger-than-life persona was a man shaped by years of complex relationships, ambitious goals, and a relentless drive to prove himself. Born in Queens, New York, in 1946, Trump had always been surrounded by wealth and privilege. His father, Fred Trump, was a real estate developer who built a fortune in residential properties, mostly in the boroughs of New York City. Growing up in a world of opulence and power, Trump was groomed from a young age to be a leader. His father, however, was no easy taskmaster. He was a tough, no-nonsense businessman who instilled a sense of perfectionism in his children. Trump's upbringing was a mix of high expectations and harsh criticism. His father demanded excellence, often pushing Donald to outdo his siblings. Yet despite the pressure, Donald thrived on competition. In school, he excelled, although his teachers and peers would describe him as something of a troublemaker. Confident to the point of arrogance, often challenging authority, and never afraid to speak his mind. At age 13, he was sent to New York Military Academy after a few incidents that were deemed problematic. It was here that the foundations of his bold and aggressive personality took root. After completing his education at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, Trump joined his father's business, but it wasn't long before he wanted more. Fred Trump had made his money by focusing on middle-class housing, but Donald had bigger dreams. He moved his focus to Manhattan, aiming to make a name for himself in the world of luxury real estate. His first big deal in Manhattan was the transformation of the old Commodore Hotel into the Trump Hotel, an ambitious project that many doubted would succeed. But Trump, never one to shy away from challenges, secured the financing, revamped the building, and turned it into a showpiece. The success of the hotel marked the beginning of a new chapter in Trump's career, a chapter where his name would become synonymous with extravagance, luxury, and grandeur. For years, he built his empire: Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, Trump World Tower, and numerous other developments that placed his name on the global map. But success came with its own set of challenges. His personal life, too, had been marked by ambition and excess. Trump's marriages were highly publicized, first to Ivana Trump, then to Marla Maples, and later to Melania Trump. Each marriage, with its own share of public drama, became part of the larger narrative of his life, a story of personal reinvention, failures, and victories. Yet for all his wealth, power, and public persona, there was a part of Trump that remained untouched by it all: loneliness. While he was constantly surrounded by people, politicians, business partners, celebrities, he often found himself isolated in a way that few could understand. His relationships, though many, were often transactional. Love, for him, had always seemed to be something that could be bargained for or won, but rarely something that simply existed. As the years passed, Trump's ambition continued to drive him forward. He became a reality TV star, his show The Apprentice making him a household name across the country. The show, in many ways, encapsulated his persona: decisive, charismatic, ruthless in his pursuit of success. His catchphrase, "You're fired," became iconic, symbolizing his brand of leadership. In 2016, Trump made the ultimate leap. He ran for president. Against all odds, he defied expectations, challenging a political system that seemed set in its ways. His campaign, fueled by populism, controversy, and promises of bringing change to Washington, resonated with millions of Americans. He won the presidency in a stunning upset, securing a spot in history as one of the most unconventional presidents the country had ever seen. But despite his political success, Trump's personal life had become increasingly chaotic. The constant scrutiny, the legal battles, the public controversies, these things weighed on him. His presidency was marked by extreme polarization, with half the country viewing him as a hero, while the other half saw him as a villain. It was a world of extremes, where no middle ground seemed possible. The pressures of leading the country had taken their toll, and by the time he left office, Trump was weary. The loss of the 2020 election left a mark on him, a sense that perhaps his time in the spotlight was coming to an end. Yet, in the depths of his disappointment, he still clung to the idea of a comeback, a return to the business world, to the public eye, where he could once again control his narrative. Still, despite his triumphs, his fame, and his fortune, Trump often found himself searching for something more. What was the point of it all? Was success just about accumulating wealth and power? Was there more to life than just the next big deal, the next shiny building with his name on it? It was a question that had haunted him for years, but never one he had been able to answer, until now. Sarah's story, the woman he had just met on the street, was about to shift everything Trump thought he knew about life. Her story wasn't one of wealth or power. It wasn't about influence or grandeur. It was a story of survival, of loss, and of a forgotten part of the world that Trump had never truly acknowledged. But in that moment, as he stood there on the busy streets of Manhattan, Trump realized that maybe it wasn't just about the towers, the deals, or the fame. Maybe it was about something else, something deeper, something that, for the first time in a long time, made him wonder if his legacy could be about more than just money. As the motorcade began moving again and the bustling city of New York resumed its frenetic pace, Donald Trump couldn't shake the image of Sarah, the homeless woman, from his mind. Her face, lined with years of struggle and heartache, lingered in his thoughts. The woman, sitting on the cold concrete, holding a simple cardboard sign, had unknowingly stopped him in his tracks. And it wasn't just her appearance that had stuck with him. It was her story, the rawness and vulnerability that she had shared with him. Back in the comfort of his luxury SUV, Trump sat in the silence, his hands resting on his lap, his mind racing. The weight of the encounter was heavier than he expected. He had spoken to thousands of people in his life, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, and commanded entire industries, but never had a conversation felt so real, so profound. This wasn't a politician's scripted speech or a business meeting filled with doublespeak. This was raw, human connection. His bodyguard, a stoic figure named Mike, noticed his boss's distracted state. "Mr. Trump, we're nearly at the venue. We're going to be late if we don't move fast," Mike said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a sharp blade. Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared out of the window, watching the crowds on the sidewalk, the street vendors hawking their wares, and the cars honking in frustration. Life continued to unfold, oblivious to his inner turmoil. "We should really focus on the next meeting," Mike added, trying again to bring Trump back to the task at hand. "This could be another major setback if we don't make an entrance on time." Trump turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "I know, Mike, but I can't stop thinking about that woman, Sarah." There's something there? Mike raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He'd been around Trump long enough to know that his boss didn't dwell on things unless they were important, and this seemed like something more than just a fleeting moment. Over the next few days, Trump found himself haunted by that brief encounter. He kept replaying their conversation in his mind, particularly the part where Sarah spoke about losing everything: her family, her job, and ultimately, her dignity. It was a story he had heard in passing before, but never one that had struck him so deeply. He had always been about the winners, people who made it big, people who triumphed against the odds. But Sarah's story didn't fit that mold. It was a story of loss, of struggle, and of being forgotten by the very system that was supposed to lift people up. The more he thought about it, the more he began to question things. Was the system really working? He had built his career on a foundation of self-reliance, hard work, and ambition. But Sarah's life was a glaring reminder that, for some, those ideals didn't hold up. They had no chance to compete, no place in the race. It wasn't just about money or grit. It was about being given the opportunity to succeed in the first place. For years, Trump had focused on wealth and power. His own, of course, and the power of his companies, his brand, his political influence. But now, a new question was starting to take root. What good was all of that power if it didn't help the people who needed it the most? In his penthouse overlooking the city, Trump met with a group of his closest advisors, people who had been with him through thick and thin. As they gathered around the conference table, Trump noticed the usual energy in the room was absent. They were discussing the next phase of his business ventures, as expected. But his mind wasn't on the deals or the plans for new developments. "Mr. Trump, we've got a huge opportunity in the works," one of his senior advisors, Tom, began, laying out the figures on the table. "This will be another one for the books. The kind of deal that cements your legacy for decades to come." Trump barely glanced at the papers, his attention far away. He drummed his fingers on the table, deep in thought. "What do you think about the homeless problem in this city?" he asked, surprising everyone in the room. Tom blinked, caught off guard. Well, it's a major issue. We've all seen the rise in the number of people on the streets. But it's complicated. You know, people make their own choices. The government has programs, but they're underfunded and inefficient." Trump nodded slowly, but his eyes seemed distant, almost lost in thought. "I met a woman the other day, Sarah, a homeless woman in Manhattan. She told me how she lost everything, how she was abandoned by the system. And I've been thinking about it. A lot." The room fell silent. This wasn't the kind of conversation they were used to having with him. Trump wasn't known for discussing social issues, especially those as complicated as homelessness. "You want to get involved in that?" Tom asked hesitantly. "Mr. Trump, no offense, but that's not exactly your area. You've built your brand around wealth, real estate, power. People don't expect you to be the voice of the homeless." Trump's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something more vulnerable beneath the surface. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I've been too focused on my own world, too focused on what I can do to build more power, more wealth. Maybe it's time to think about the people who've been left out of that equation." There was a pause as the room processed his words. No one knew what to say. Tom shifted uncomfortably. "It's noble, Mr. Trump, but we need to be careful. Getting involved in something like this could hurt your brand. You've built your reputation on being a winner. People like you because you're successful. Helping the homeless could be seen as, I don't know, too soft, too political." Trump looked out the window, his mind far from the sterile office environment around him. "Maybe I need to stop worrying about what people think. Maybe I need to do what's right, not just what's popular." That evening, Trump found himself unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted in him. It wasn't just about the business, the fame, or the next big deal. He knew deep down that Sarah's story had made him see things differently. And while he still didn't have all the answers, he was beginning to realize that his life could be about more than just wealth and power. But the conflict inside him was growing stronger. Would helping people like Sarah compromise his legacy? Could he, the man who had always been the embodiment of success, find a way to give back without losing the image he had worked so hard to build? It was clear that the choice he was facing wasn't going to be an easy one. There were forces pulling him in two different directions: the world of power, wealth, and success that he knew so well? In the world of struggle, compassion, and social change, a world that felt, for the first time in his life, like a place he might want to be. The decision was looming, and soon he would have to choose. The days following his conversation with his advisors were filled with restless thoughts and quiet reflection. Donald Trump had always been a man of action. For years, he'd made decisions quickly, with precision and confidence. But this felt different. It wasn't a business deal or a political maneuver. This was about something far deeper, something that had the potential to redefine everything he had built. He spent the next few nights tossing and turning in his luxury penthouse, staring out at the skyline of New York City. The lights of the towers seemed to mock him, each one a symbol of his empire, his success. But the view no longer filled him with pride. Instead, it left him with a gnawing emptiness. What was all of this for? The homeless woman he had met, Sarah, was never far from his mind. She had said so little, but what she had said had been enough to shake him to his core. "I lost everything," she had told him. "I didn't ask for this, but here I am." In the privacy of his penthouse, Trump allowed himself to truly sit with her words. He had always prided himself on never being weak, on always rising above adversity. But the reality of Sarah's situation hit him with a truth he wasn't prepared for. Not everyone had the luxury of rising. Some people, no matter how hard they fought, simply couldn't. Trump's phone buzzed, breaking him out of his thoughts. It was a text from one of his closest aides, Carol, a woman who had been with him through thick and thin. She had seen all of his highs and lows, and she knew him better than most. "Mr. Trump, the meeting with the mayor's office is set for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Are you still going to attend? It's an important one for your future plans." Trump stared at the message for a moment. He had been scheduled to attend yet another high-profile meeting about his upcoming business ventures, new developments, new investments, the kind of deals that would further cement his legacy. But now, as he stared at the screen, the urgency of it all seemed trivial. He typed a quick response. "Cancel it. I'm changing course." The next morning, Trump did something that shocked everyone around him. He canceled his meetings, including the high-profile one with the mayor's office, and instead instructed his staff to prepare for something completely different. A press conference. But this wasn't going to be the typical Trump spectacle, where he would stand at the podium and make bold claims about his latest ventures. No, this was going to be something else entirely. At 11 a.m., Trump stood at the front of a small conference room, flanked by his team. Reporters from all over the city gathered, uncertain of what to expect. The tension in the room was palpable. Trump had never been one to shy away from controversy, but today felt different. This wasn't a room full of supporters or media hungry for soundbites. This was something far more personal. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. "Thank you for coming," Trump began, his voice steady but calm, far softer than his usual tone. The room fell silent, reporters hanging on his every word. "Today, I want to talk about something that has been on my mind for some time now." There was an air of confusion. The usual bravado was absent. Trump paused, glancing down at his notes but not needing them. He wasn't delivering a speech. He was opening himself up in a way that few had ever seen. "I've spent most of my life building businesses, building power, building wealth," Trump continued. "But in doing so, I've lost sight of something very important. The people who don't have those opportunities. People who fall through the cracks. People who are ignored, forgotten." There was a murmur of surprise in the room. Trump, the man who had built his entire life around the pursuit of success, was now talking about the forgotten? The ones who didn't make it? This wasn't the Trump anyone knew. "I recently met a woman named Sarah," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "She's homeless, and she shared her story with me. It made me realize that no matter how successful you are, there are still things that money and power can't fix. There are people out there who are struggling every day just to survive, and they don't have a voice." He paused, looking directly into the cameras, into the eyes of the reporters, as though he were speaking directly to each one of them. "I've decided to dedicate a significant portion of my resources to addressing homelessness in this city and across the country. It's time for me to put my name behind something that matters, something that can truly make a difference." The room was silent. The reporters exchanged uncertain glances. No one had expected this. But Trump wasn't done. "I've spent years talking about what we can build: towers, hotels, golf courses. But today, I'm talking about something more important. A system where every person, regardless of their background or their situation, has a chance to succeed. I want to build a network of shelters, rehabilitation centers, and support systems that not only provide a roof, but also give people the tools they need to rebuild their lives." Trump's voice grew stronger now, a flicker of his familiar determination returning. "This isn't about politics. This isn't about my image or my brand. This is about doing what's right. And I don't care if it's hard. I don't care if it's controversial. I'm going to do this because it's needed. And I believe I can make a difference." For a moment, no one moved. The reporters stared at him, some with skepticism, others with disbelief. Trump had always been a man of grand gestures and bold statements, but this was a pivot no one saw coming. He wasn't just talking about money. He wasn't talking about power. He was talking about people. Finally, one reporter stood up, shaking his head in disbelief. "Mr. Trump, with all due respect, you've spent your career building an empire on the principles of capitalism and individualism. How do you reconcile that with dedicating your fortune to a cause like homelessness, which is often seen as a social issue, not a business opportunity?" Trump smiled, but there was no arrogance in it, only a quiet conviction. "I've built an empire, but now I'm going to use it to help people. If I can create jobs, if I can build towers, I can build something that actually changes lives. I've always believed that anything is possible if you're willing to put in the work. Well, this is the work I'm choosing now." The press conference ended shortly after, leaving behind a trail of speculation, confusion, and awe. The media would run their stories, and the world would weigh in, as it always did when Trump made an announcement. But this time, there was something different in the air. This wasn't just another Trump move to grab attention. This felt like something more, something that might actually change the course of his life. As Trump left the conference room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve settle over him. The journey ahead would be anything but easy. There would be resistance, there would be doubters. But for the first time in years, he was sure of one thing. This was the right choice. He had just begun a new chapter, a chapter that, for the first time, wasn't about winning for himself. It was about winning for others. And that was something he was willing to fight for. In the days that followed his bold press conference, Donald Trump found himself in uncharted territory. The media, of course, had a field day with his announcement. Some praised him for taking on the issue of homelessness, hailing his decision as a turning point for the former president and billionaire businessman. Others were more cynical, questioning his motives and whether this was just another publicity stunt. Trump had learned to weather media storms. He was used to being in the headlines for one reason or another. But this was different. This time, it wasn't about him. It was about an issue that was far bigger than his name, something that had plagued society for decades, and that no amount of money or power seemed to fix. Homelessness was an ugly truth, a problem that no one had solved despite countless attempts, and now Trump was taking it head-on. The first hurdle was figuring out where to begin. Trump's team scrambled to put together a task force of experts in homelessness, social work, and urban development. They held meetings with representatives from shelters, nonprofit organizations, and city officials. But no one had a clear-cut answer on how to solve the problem. There were no simple solutions, no easy fixes. The issue wasn't just about providing temporary shelter. It was about long-term rehabilitation, mental health care, addiction treatment, job training, and affordable housing. It was a multifaceted crisis that required a nuanced approach. Trump's initial vision of building shelters and support systems was just the beginning, but the scope of what was needed was far broader than he had anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Trump faced growing criticism from several quarters. Many of his political allies questioned his decision to pivot towards homelessness. They argued that it would tarnish his brand, undermine his reputation as a self-made businessman, and alienate the base that had supported him during his presidency. "You're known for building things, Mr. Trump," one of his closest allies, Mark, told him in a private meeting. "You can't be the guy who solves homelessness. That's not your brand. It's not what you stand for." Trump frowned, but he wasn't swayed. He had heard these arguments before, from people who only cared about image and public perception. But what about the people who were truly suffering? What about the lives that were being destroyed every day by addiction, by mental illness, by poverty? Could he continue to stand by and do nothing simply because it might hurt his image? "I didn't build my brand on being a politician, Mark," Trump replied, his tone firm. "I built it on making things happen. I've faced bigger challenges than this. You think they'll remember me for my buildings? Or do you think they'll remember me for making a real difference in the lives of people who need it the most?" Mark remained silent, but Trump could see the doubt in his eyes. This wasn't the kind of project that was going to generate instant financial returns or rally the political base. It wasn't a win in the traditional sense, and that made it difficult for those around him to understand. Despite the resistance, Trump pressed on. He poured millions into the project, determined to make it work. But as the months went by, it became clear that success wouldn't come overnight. He visited shelters and spoke to the homeless, hearing stories that both broke his heart and ignited his sense of urgency. He met veterans living on the streets, mothers with children who had no place to turn, and young men and women who had been abandoned by society. But progress was slow. The bureaucratic red tape, the resistance from local governments, the lack of comprehensive policies, all of it made the task seem daunting. For every step forward, it felt like 2 steps back. One evening, after a long day of meetings and site visits, Trump sat in his office, staring at a stack of reports on his desk. His advisors had given him countless ideas, ranging from large-scale shelter construction to partnerships with nonprofit organizations. But none of it felt like enough. None of it addressed the root of the problem. He looked at the city skyline through his office window, his mind heavy with frustration. There was a part of him that had expected a faster result. He had always been a man of action, used to immediate feedback and tangible results. But this was different. This was a fight that would take years, maybe decades, to win. The path forward was unclear, and the obstacles seemed insurmountable. It was then that he remembered Sarah. Her face, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resignation. She had been so open, so honest with him, yet she had also been resigned to her fate. What if this was bigger than just building shelters? What if the entire system needed to be rethought from the ground up? Trump knew that he wasn't just dealing with a social problem. He was dealing with a systemic failure. It wasn't enough to build shelters and provide temporary fixes. What was needed was a complete overhaul of the way society approached homelessness, starting with the very systems that had failed these people in the first place. The next morning, Trump called together a new task force, one made up of not only experts but also advocates, people who had lived through homelessness and individuals who had worked on the ground in some of the most devastated communities. He wanted to hear their perspectives, what was working, and more importantly, what wasn't. The first person he brought in was Sarah. He had kept in touch with her since their first meeting, and although she had been hesitant to accept help, he insisted that she come and share her story with the group. She entered the room cautiously, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor. The other members of the task force greeted her with respectful nods, recognizing that her voice was one of the most important in the room. "Sarah," Trump said, looking directly at her, "I need to hear from you. What is it that you need? What would have made a difference for you?" Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Trump's. "What I needed was a chance to start over. I needed help getting back on my feet. Real help, not just a bed for the night, but a way out. I was always told that if I just worked harder, I could get back to where I was. But no one ever told me how." Trump nodded slowly. This was the missing piece, the understanding that homelessness wasn't just a matter of being poor or lazy. It was about a lack of opportunity, a lack of resources, and a lack of support when you needed it most. And the system, as it stood, was built to keep people like Sarah stuck in a cycle of despair. As the task force continued their discussions, Trump's mind raced. He wasn't just going to build shelters. He was going to build opportunities, affordable housing, job training programs, mental health services, and long-term rehabilitation. He would work with local governments, businesses, and community organizations to create a comprehensive, holistic approach to solving homelessness. For the first time in months, Trump felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but it was something he could build, and something that could make a difference. The path was still unclear, but Trump now had a vision. a vision that wasn't about creating another empire, but about helping people rebuild their lives. It wasn't about personal gain or fame. It was about using his resources and influence to change the way the system worked for people who had been left behind. Sarah's story had started a chain reaction in Trump's life, a shift that would ultimately change not just his legacy, but the lives of countless others. The road ahead was uncertain, and the obstacles were immense. But he was ready, because this time, it wasn't about winning for himself, it was about winning for them. And that was a battle worth fighting. As the weeks turned into months, Trump's vision for addressing homelessness began to take shape. The initial stages had been chaotic, filled with planning sessions, resistance, and frustrations. But something was different now. He had made a public commitment, and although the naysayers continued to question his motives, Trump was determined to see it through. The battle was no longer about politics, media attention, or legacy. It was personal. He met with experts, community leaders, and people who had first-hand experience with homelessness, trying to learn as much as he could. He spent hours in shelters, talking to the homeless. He wanted to understand the complexity of the issue in its entirety. It wasn't just about a lack of housing. It was about addiction, mental health, lack of education, and a system that often seemed built to fail. It wasn't until Trump sat down with the mayor's office in New York City that things began to click into place. Mayor Linda Ramos had been a skeptic of Trump's plan from the beginning. She had dealt with the issue of homelessness in the city for years, and though she believed in solutions, she also knew how difficult it was to make any real progress. Trump came into the meeting with a different kind of energy this time. He didn't arrive with his usual bravado or larger-than-life confidence. He came in quietly, with the understanding that the battle he was fighting wasn't about ego. It was about collaboration. "I know you've heard all the promises before," Trump said, his voice calm and steady. "But this time, it's different. I'm not here to just talk. I'm here to put my money where my mouth is." The mayor raised an eyebrow. She had been part of many discussions over the years, but what Trump was suggesting wasn't just another shelter-building program. It was an entire infrastructure overhaul. He wanted to build not just shelters but rehabilitation centers, mental health clinics, job training programs, and affordable housing. "I'm not a social worker, Mr. Trump," the mayor said, her tone cautious. "And I'm not sure you fully grasp the scope of what you're asking for." Trump leaned forward, looking her in the eye. "I know. I'm not pretending to know everything, but I'm willing to bring in the right people to make this work. I've done this before, built things from the ground up. If we don't get the cooperation of the local government and the right resources, this whole thing falls apart." For the first time, the mayor seemed to consider his words seriously. She knew that Trump had the resources and the connections to make something big happen. But it wasn't just money. It was about creating an environment of trust and collaboration. "I can't promise you anything," Mayor Ramos said finally, "but we'll give it a shot. If you're really serious about changing things, you'll need to work with us, not against us. But I'll be damned if I don't help you try." With the mayor on board, Trump's initiative began to gain traction. He established a large-scale task force composed of government officials, experts in social work, mental health professionals, and business leaders. But he didn't stop there. He also brought in voices from the people who had experienced homelessness firsthand. They weren't just advisors. They were integral to shaping the direction of the project. One of those voices was Sarah. Despite her initial hesitation, Sarah had been working alongside Trump, attending meetings, and helping develop strategies for outreach. She had become a trusted part of his team. Her first-hand knowledge of the struggles of homeless people invaluable in ensuring the program would be effective. "What we need," Sarah said during one meeting, "isn't just a place to sleep. We need to teach people how to live again, how to feel human again. When you're on the streets, you lose yourself. You lose your dignity. We need to focus on the whole person." Trump nodded. This was a perspective he hadn't fully understood until now, but it was the key to the program's success. Shelters weren't enough. People needed a sense of purpose, a reason to fight through the struggle. Months of planning and collaboration finally led to the opening of the first comprehensive shelter in New York. But it wasn't just a shelter, it was the first step toward a new way of thinking about homelessness. This new facility provided housing, but also offered counseling, job training, and mental health services. There were even classes on financial literacy and life skills. For the first time, The homeless were given more than just a bed. They were given a chance at a new life. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning, and Trump was there, front and center, proudly watching as the first group of residents entered the facility. The media was there, of course, and so were dozens of advocates and local leaders who had been instrumental in the project. Trump stood beside Mayor Ramos, looking over the crowd. This wasn't about the cameras or the headlines. This was about something far more meaningful. As the first group of residents walked through the doors, Trump's mind went back to that moment he had met Sarah, the homeless woman who had started all of this. He wondered how she was doing now, whether she had found her way out of the cycle of homelessness that had held her back for so long. But he knew that her story, and the stories of so many others like her, had inspired this moment. They had started something that could change the world. The opening of the shelter was a major success, and it made waves in the media. But it was also met with mixed reactions. Many were skeptical that the approach would work, while others were praising Trump for his dedication to such an important cause. As the project continued to grow, the media kept a close eye on every move he made. One surprising ally was Mark, Trump's longtime business associate, who had originally expressed doubt about the direction the former president had chosen. After visiting the new shelter and seeing the transformation taking place, Mark changed his tune. "I didn't get it at first, Donald," Mark admitted during a phone call. "But after seeing how this place operates, I'm sold. You're doing something that no one else has ever done." Trump smiled. He had heard plenty of critics, but it was the voices of those who were beginning to understand that kept him going. Mark's words were a reminder that even the most skeptical people could come around when they saw the impact firsthand. The first shelter was just the beginning. Trump had always been a man who saw things through, no matter how difficult the journey. Now, he was committed to expanding the initiative beyond New York City, to cities across the country, to communities that had long been left behind. There were still challenges ahead: funding issues, political hurdles, and resistance from various corners of society. But Trump wasn't backing down. He had built an empire once before, and now he was building something that could change the course of many lives. As he sat in his office late one night, reviewing the latest reports from his task force, Trump found himself reflecting on how far he had come. From that first encounter with Sarah to this moment of tangible progress, the road had been long. But he had learned more than he ever expected about the human spirit, about resilience, and about the power of second chances. For the first time in his life, Trump wasn't just building something for himself. He was building something that would last far beyond his name. He wasn't just providing shelter. He was giving people the chance to rebuild their lives. And with that, he knew the journey was just beginning. The weeks following the opening of the first comprehensive shelter were a whirlwind of activity. The media coverage was intense, with reporters and journalists buzzing around every development. Trump's initiative had made national headlines, and people were paying attention. The public reaction was mixed, as expected, but there was a growing sense that, perhaps for the first time, real change was within reach. While some critics remained skeptical, many others, including former allies and even political rivals, began to acknowledge the scale and ambition of Trump's vision. The narrative was no longer about a former president chasing headlines for the sake of his image. This was about something much larger, a fundamental shift in how society dealt with the issue of homelessness. Trump wasted no time in expanding the program beyond New York City. His team was already in discussions with local governments in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami, 3 cities with some of the highest rates of homelessness in the country. But expansion was not as easy as simply opening new shelters. Each city had its unique challenges, and Trump knew that his approach would need to be tailored to fit the needs of each community. The biggest hurdle in every city was the same: finding enough space for the homeless and securing funding for long-term solutions. Affordable housing had always been a challenge, and many of the areas with high homelessness rates were already struggling with gentrification and rising rents. However, Trump was determined. He wasn't going to let these obstacles derail the project. "We're not just going to build shelters," Trump said during a strategy meeting with his team. "We're going to create sustainable communities. We need to partner with developers, we need to partner with businesses, and we need to convince local governments that this is a long-term investment." The task force quickly grew in size and complexity, with new specialists joining the effort. Trump wasn't just surrounded by political figures anymore. He had brought in architects, urban planners, financial experts, and social workers who were all equally committed to tackling the homelessness crisis. Together, they began crafting the blueprints for what would become a national initiative, one that would focus not just on housing but also on education, employment, healthcare, and rebuilding lives. As the project expanded, Sarah's role within the initiative also grew. From the beginning, she had been a crucial voice. Her personal story had resonated deeply with Trump, and she had become a trusted advisor. But as the plan began to evolve, Sarah's insight into the daily struggles of homeless individuals made her indispensable. Sarah's work was no longer limited to advising. She became a leader in the community engagement aspect of the project. She traveled to different cities, speaking at public forums, meeting with homeless people directly, and working with local teams to ensure the programs were designed with the real needs of the homeless in mind. "Sarah," Trump said during one of their regular check-ins, "you're the heart of this operation. People listen to you because they know you understand. You've lived it. Keep pushing us to do better." Sarah's heart swelled with pride. She had never imagined that her story could lead to something this monumental. But now, as she looked at the lives that were beginning to change, she saw the possibility of real transformation, not just for herself but for countless others. Just when things seemed to be moving forward, a significant setback threatened the momentum of Trump's initiative. In Los Angeles, the city's local government began to resist the proposed plan. There was opposition from community activists who felt that Trump's involvement in the project was more about personal publicity than real change. The controversy centered on the fact that Trump's initiative, while well-funded, lacked a clear framework for long-term sustainability. Critics argued that Trump was simply building temporary solutions to a deeply entrenched problem, not addressing the systemic issues that caused homelessness in the first place. A fiery protest erupted outside one of the newly opened shelters, with activists demanding that Trump meet with local community groups to address their concerns. The protesters argued that the focus on homelessness had overshadowed other critical issues, like affordable health care, education, and job creation. The media, sensing an opportunity for drama, latched onto the growing tension, framing the debate as a standoff between Trump and progressive activists. Headlines screamed, "Trump faces backlash over homelessness initiative," and "Los Angeles shelter protested over lack of long-term solutions." The backlash was fierce, and Trump found himself in a familiar position, fending off critics, both in the media and in the streets. But instead of backing down, Trump took it as an opportunity to double down on his commitment to the project. Trump knew that to keep the momentum going, he would need to confront the criticisms head-on. He called for a public town hall in Los Angeles, where he would address the concerns of the activists and the community at large. It was a risky move, but Trump wasn't one to shy away from confrontation. He understood the value of public relations, and he knew that a direct dialogue with his critics could strengthen his initiative in the long run. The event took place in a large hall, with hundreds of people in attendance: community leaders, activists, social workers, business owners, and of course, the media. Trump stood at the podium, flanked by Sarah and Mayor Ramos. As he began to speak, his tone was measured, his confidence unwavering. "I understand that many of you are skeptical," Trump began. "And I get it. We're dealing with a massive problem here, and for far too long, no one has had the courage to face it head-on. I'm not here to make promises I can't keep, but I can tell you this. I'm committed to doing everything I can to create real change." He acknowledged the criticisms about the project's sustainability and admitted that there was still a lot of work to be done. But he made it clear that his goal was not just to provide temporary fixes. It was to rebuild communities, restore dignity, and give people the tools to rebuild their lives. "We're not just building shelters. We're building hope. And that's something we can all get behind," Trump said, his voice growing firmer with each word. "This is not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about creating opportunities. We're going to keep working with community leaders, with activists, and with those who have lived through homelessness to make this the solution we need." The room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed as though Trump had won over the crowd. Then, a voice from the back called out, "What about mental health services? What about job training? What are you doing to address the root causes?" Trump didn't hesitate. He had answers ready. ones that he had spent countless hours developing with his team. We're addressing all of that. Mental health, addiction, job training, education. This initiative is about breaking the cycle, not just offering a temporary solution. This is long-term, and we're committed to seeing it through. By the end of the town hall, the tone had shifted. While some remained unconvinced, many of the protesters seemed to soften their stance. Trump had faced his critics with openness and a clear plan, something they had rarely seen from politicians in the past. The event marked a turning point. It wasn't just about Trump anymore. It was about the collective effort of a community coming together to solve a deep-rooted issue. The public dialogue continued, but now it was more about collaboration than confrontation. Trump's leadership, combined with the voices of people like Sarah, the local activists and community leaders, began to reshape the narrative. By the end of the year, the first phase of the initiative had expanded to several major cities across the United States. New shelters, rehabilitation centers, and job training programs were springing up in areas that had once been forgotten by mainstream society. But even as the project gained steam, Trump knew the real challenge was just beginning. Homelessness wasn't going to disappear overnight, and the issues of mental health, addiction, and lack of opportunity ran deep. But there was something different in the air now. People were starting to believe in the possibility of change, and that belief was the fuel that would drive this initiative forward. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Trump saw a clear path. He wasn't just building buildings or programs. He was building a future, and that future had the potential to change everything. The momentum was undeniable. As Trump's homelessness initiative expanded across the country, his team began to see tangible results. Shelters were filled to capacity, job training programs were helping people find new employment, and many individuals were starting to rebuild their lives. But there were still challenges ahead, and the real test was whether the efforts would have lasting, meaningful impact. While the media continued to cover the success stories, Trump knew that many of the people involved, community leaders, local businesses, and homeless individuals themselves, needed more than just buildings and programs. They needed trust. Trust in the initiative, in its ability to deliver results, and in the people driving it. It was clear to Trump that this wasn't just a top-down operation. This wasn't about imposing solutions from the outside. It was about working with the communities, listening to the people, and finding ways to support their autonomy while offering resources. It was a rainy afternoon in Chicago when Trump met with the city's leadership to discuss the progress of the program. Mayor Allison Cole had been a strong supporter of the initiative from the beginning, but like most leaders, she was under pressure. Pressure from the public, from local businesses, and from other politicians who weren't convinced that Trump's vision would bring lasting change. "I'm with you on the idea, Donald," Mayor Cole said, looking at the reports in front of her. "But we're seeing some pushback. People are starting to question whether this approach will actually help with the bigger issue of poverty in this city." Trump nodded, understanding the weight of the challenge. "I get it. It's hard to believe change is possible when you've seen the same issues cycle through year after year. But we're doing something different. This isn't just about giving people a place to sleep. It's about rebuilding their dignity, their purpose, and their hope. Once they've got that, they can make their own way." The mayor leaned back, thinking about the families in her city struggling to make ends meet. She'd seen the rise in homelessness, felt the strain on public services, and knew how hard it was to change a problem that seemed so entrenched. "I don't disagree with you, Donald," she said, her voice softening. "But trust is the hardest thing to earn in politics. People need to see results, not just promises. And we need to ensure we're not overlooking the underlying problems that created this crisis in the first place." Trump met her gaze with a steely focus. "We're not overlooking them, but we're tackling them one step at a time. And I promise you, we will show results. People will see that we're not here to just sweep the issue under the rug. We're here to make it better." As Trump continued his meetings across the country, he became more and more convinced that the key to the success of his initiative lay in the personal stories of the people it helped. Numbers and statistics were important, of course, but it was the real-life experiences that had the power to connect people to the cause. One day, Sarah reached out to Trump with an idea. She suggested that they start collecting and sharing the stories of the residents at the shelters, their struggles, their triumphs, and the transformation they were experiencing. Trump had always been a fan of storytelling. It was something that resonated with people on a deeper level than facts and figures. So he took Sarah's idea and ran with it. Together, they launched a series of video diaries featuring residents of the shelters, people who had gone from living on the streets to rebuilding their lives with the help of the program. The first video featured Marcus, a former construction worker in his late 40s who had spent the last few years living on the streets of Miami. In the video, Marcus spoke about the shame and loneliness that came with being homeless, but also about the hope he found when he entered one of Trump's shelters. He talked about the job training program that helped him learn new skills, the mental health counseling that helped him process his past trauma, and how, for the first time in years, he felt like he had a future again. Marcus ended the video with a simple, powerful message. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living. And I'm not alone. The video series went viral. The stories of people like Marcus, and later others like Linda, a single mother of two who had found a stable job after leaving the shelter, became a touchstone for the success of Trump's initiative. People began to see the program in a new light, not just as a political venture, but as a human one. But the ripple effect of these personal stories went beyond social media. Local businesses began to get involved, offering job placements to people who had gone through the program. Volunteer groups began to flood the shelters, wanting to help in any way they could. Local schools and universities offered educational opportunities to the homeless, seeing the potential in individuals who had once been written off. Trump couldn't help but be proud. The initiative was no longer just about his legacy. It was about giving people the chance to rewrite their own stories. The progress was slow, and there were still setbacks, but there was undeniable momentum. The real question was how far this movement could go. But as the initiative expanded, the political resistance grew more vocal. Trump had known this would happen. It was a given that some would continue to view his involvement as self-serving. But what surprised him was the growing opposition from within his own party. Republican leaders who had supported him during his time in office began to speak out against his homelessness initiative, arguing that it was a waste of taxpayer dollars and that the government had no business trying to solve social problems at such a large scale. I've built businesses. I've run a country. I've seen success and failure. But I've never seen anything like this before, one of Trump's former allies in Congress said during a press conference. This isn't about business. This is about throwing money at a problem without any real solutions. Trump had been bracing for this kind of criticism. The Republican Party had always been more conservative when it came to government spending, and many saw his homelessness initiative as an overreach. However, Trump remained unfazed. He had faced criticism before, and he would face it again. But this time, he wasn't about to back down. I'm not in this for the political game, he said during a television interview. I'm in this because it's the right thing to do, and I'm going to keep doing it, no matter who tries to stand in my way. As the months wore on, the biggest challenge Trump faced was sustainability. The first shelters were functioning well, but there were more people coming in than they could accommodate. The task force had worked tirelessly to secure funding, but the sheer scope of the project was massive. Trump had invested millions of dollars into the program, but it wasn't just about money. It was about ensuring that the infrastructure would be able to support it long term. That meant not just creating more shelters, but also building affordable housing, investing in public health, and working with local businesses to provide employment opportunities for those who had been through the program. It also meant addressing the systemic issues that led to homelessness in the first place: the lack of affordable housing, inadequate mental health care, and the ever-growing divide between the wealthy and the rest of society. Trump and his team held emergency meetings almost daily, working to secure private partnerships, seek out philanthropic donations, and lobby for additional government support. It was a race against time. One evening, as Trump sat in his office late, reviewing the reports from his team, he thought back to the very beginning of this journey. He remembered that day in the alley when he met Sarah, the homeless woman whose story had sparked this entire initiative. She had changed his life in ways he could never have predicted. But now, as he stared at the financial projections and the mountain of challenges ahead, he wondered, was it enough? Was the progress they had made so far just the beginning? Or was it merely a drop in the ocean of the larger problem? He didn't have the answer, but he did know one thing. He couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. Too many lives depended on it. With a deep breath, Trump closed the folder in front of him and picked up the phone. It was time to make some calls and keep pushing forward. The days were growing shorter, and the pressure to deliver on the promise of Trump's homelessness initiative was intensifying. The headlines had shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism, but as the project expanded into more cities, the challenges became more evident. Still, one thing remained certain. Trump had awakened a national conversation about homelessness, and people were starting to listen. Despite the vocal resistance from some political circles, the support for the initiative was undeniable. People across the country were beginning to see the impact on the ground. In Los Angeles, where Trump had faced the most intense protests, things were changing. There were fewer people on the streets, and many who had once been homeless were now working in local businesses, gaining skills, and beginning to piece together their lives again. Local news outlets began reporting heartwarming stories. A woman named Linda, who had been homeless for nearly 5 years, had recently found stable work at a local restaurant. Her story, like many others, was shared on social media platforms, resonating with people far and wide. Comments flooded in, "If she can do it, why can't we help more people like her?" And, "I never thought I'd see the day when something like this could actually work." For the first time in years, the public was focusing on solutions, not just the problems. The narrative was changing, and the spotlight was on the people whose lives had been transformed. In the midst of this momentum, Trump realized that the initiative could not succeed without an even larger coalition of support. While he had always believed in the power of personal drive and leadership, he now saw the value in uniting a broader base of community leaders, business owners, and even political figures who were beginning to recognize the potential of his approach. Sarah, now firmly embedded within the project's leadership, took on a greater role in these coalition-building efforts. She traveled across the country, meeting with local activists, faith-based organizations, and business owners who wanted to get involved. Her story, once shared to raise awareness, had now become the beacon that many people rallied behind. It wasn't just about the shelters anymore. It was about empowering people, offering them opportunities, and building bridges between the wealthy and the underprivileged, between the political elite and the common people. As the initiative gained traction, the next big step came in the form of a public town hall meeting in Miami. Mayor Marcos Reyes, a longtime advocate for social welfare but with a deep distrust of Trump's political motives, agreed to host the event. She had initially been hesitant, worried that the program would either be abandoned or mismanaged, but she had seen the results in her city. Miami, like many others, had seen a sharp decline in the homeless population since Trump's shelters opened. But the real test was going to be whether the public trusted that the initiative could address the root causes of homelessness, or if it was just another short-term solution. This time, Trump knew that it wouldn't be enough to simply talk about his plans. He needed to show the public that the initiative had lasting power. He needed to prove that the system wasn't just a temporary fix, but the beginning of real, systemic change. Trump arrived at the town hall, prepared for the tough questions that were sure to come. As he walked up to the stage, he noticed Sarah sitting in the front row, her eyes full of purpose. For a moment, he caught her gaze, and she gave him a reassuring nod. The room was packed, hundreds of people, all looking for answers. Critics and supporters alike gathered, eager to see what Trump had to say. The format was straightforward, a panel discussion followed by an open Q&A. The first question came from a middle-aged man in the audience, his voice laced with skepticism. "Mr. Trump, I've heard a lot about shelters being opened, but what's the plan to stop people from becoming homeless in the first place? What's the long-term vision here?" Trump nodded, taking the question seriously. "That's a great question. And you're right. Helping people get off the streets is just the first step. We need to address the underlying issues that cause homelessness, such as lack of affordable housing, healthcare, and job opportunities. Our program isn't just about putting a roof over someone's head. It's about providing them with the tools they need to rebuild their lives." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We're working with local businesses to create job programs. We're partnering with mental health professionals to address the root causes of addiction and trauma. And we're pushing for policies that will make affordable housing more accessible to everyone." Trump's response was met with a mix of applause and murmurs of agreement. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time in months, he felt like people were starting to understand that this was more than just a political stunt. This was his legacy, and he was determined to make it work. Then came a question that hit Trump harder than any political challenge he had faced. A young woman, likely in her late 20s, stood up, her face partially obscured by a dark hoodie. She looked both vulnerable and determined as she spoke. "Mr. Trump," she began, "I've been homeless for most of my adult life. I've been in and out of shelters, but it's never been enough. Every time I got back on my feet, something happened. Health issues, job loss, addiction. I've been to rehab 3 times. I've worked jobs, and I've tried to stay clean, but the system is broken. You say you want to help people like me, but what about the ones who keep falling through the cracks?" The room went silent. Trump's eyes locked on the woman's face. Her words weren't an accusation. They were a plea for understanding. "I hear you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "And I can't pretend to know exactly what it's like to be in your shoes. But I promise you, we're not giving up on you. We're building a system that will address the issues you're talking about: addiction, mental health, lack of opportunity. It's going to take time, but I'm committed to seeing it through. You're not invisible to me, and you won't be invisible to this program." The woman nodded slowly, as if unsure whether to believe him. But there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, and that was all Trump needed to see. In Washington, the debate over Trump's homelessness initiative was reaching a boiling point. His critics in the Senate, many of whom had initially supported him, now viewed his push for national reform as an overreach. Senators on both sides of the aisle began to call for hearings to investigate the effectiveness of his program, with some accusing him of using it to bolster his political image for future ambitions. "We're talking about billions of dollars in federal funding," Senator Carl Thompson, a staunch conservative, said in an interview. "That's money that should be going toward other initiatives, not towards a program that lacks accountability and transparency." The scrutiny became more intense, and with the growing divide between Trump's supporters and detractors, the issue was bound to come to a head. The Senate was preparing for a critical vote, one that could either secure long-term funding for the initiative or lead to its dismantling. Trump had known the political risks from the start, but he wasn't ready to give up. He'd fought battles before. This one would be no different. As the vote loomed, Trump convened a meeting with his core team, including Sarah. "We've come this far," Trump said, his voice steady. "This initiative isn't just about me or my name. It's about doing the right thing. We have to fight for it, no matter what." Sarah, who had become a trusted advisor, added, "We're in this together, Donald. It's not just the shelters, it's the people. We can't let go of that. That's what will keep us moving forward." As the Senate vote approached, Trump found himself at a crossroads. He had built something that was changing lives, but the forces of political opposition were powerful. What would the future hold? Would his initiative survive the scrutiny, or would the critics succeed in shutting it down? As he prepared for another round of debates and votes, one thing was clear. No matter the outcome, this fight had already changed him. The questions of politics and legacy no longer seemed as important. What mattered now was the lives of those who had been given a second chance, the stories of people like Marcus, Linda, and the young woman who had spoken so bravely at the town hall. They were his proof that change was possible. And Trump knew that no matter how this fight ended, it wasn't over. The real work, the hard work, was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The day of the Senate vote arrived, and with it, a deep sense of uncertainty hung in the air. For months, Trump and his team had been battling behind the scenes, working tirelessly to sway lawmakers, rally support, and fend off growing opposition. The initiative to help the homeless had become more than just a political battle. It was a test of his resolve, his values, and his belief in the power of second chances. As he sat in the Oval Office, the weight of the moment was palpable. Sarah was there, standing by his side, her face filled with determination. She had become more than just an advisor. She was a symbol of everything the initiative stood for. Her transformation had mirrored that of the thousands of people whose lives had been touched by the program. And now, as the pressure mounted, she remained a source of calm in the storm. "We've done everything we can," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "Now, it's out of our hands. But I believe in this. I believe in us." Trump nodded, though his mind was racing. He'd never been one to back down from a fight, but this was different. This was a battle not just for his legacy, but for something much bigger. Something that could change the way America viewed homelessness, poverty, and the possibility of redemption. The Senate chamber was packed, the air thick with tension. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment as lawmakers filed in for the vote. Opponents of the initiative were vocal in their criticism, but supporters, many of whom had been swayed by the stories of real people whose lives had been transformed, were just as adamant in their defense. When the roll call began, the room fell into an eerie silence. Senators' names were called one by one as they cast their votes, some with a sense of duty, others with a sense of hesitation. Every vote was crucial, every decision a potential tipping point. Trump's fate, and the fate of the homeless initiative, rested in the hands of a handful of key figures. It was Senator Carl Thompson's vote that everyone had been waiting for. The influential conservative had been a fierce critic of Trump's approach, calling it an overreach of government power. But now, as his name was called, all eyes turned to him. Thompson paused, glancing down at the ballot in his hand. The tension in the room was palpable as he took his time. Finally, he cast his vote. The result wasn't what anyone had expected. Yeah. The room erupted in a mix of surprise, relief, and cautious optimism. Thompson's vote was a game-changer. It was a clear signal that the tide was turning, that the initiative might just have the momentum it needed to survive. When the final vote tally was announced, Trump let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The initiative had passed. His vision for tackling homelessness, for offering second chances to those who had been forgotten, had won the support of the Senate. But the victory felt different than he'd imagined. It wasn't a celebratory moment. There were no champagne toasts or loud cheers. Instead, it was a quiet reflection on how far they had come, and how much farther they still had to go. Sarah was the first to congratulate him, offering a handshake that felt more like an embrace. "You did it. We did it." Trump gave her a small smile. "This is just the beginning, Sarah. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." As the news broke, the media response was overwhelming. Headlines across the country heralded the vote as a victory for the homeless, for social justice, and for a more compassionate society. Trump's critics were forced to acknowledge that the initiative had gathered significant momentum, while his supporters celebrated what they saw as a bold move in tackling one of the country's most persistent issues. The narrative, once dominated by skepticism and resistance, was beginning to shift in Trump's favor. The program wasn't perfect, and there were still hurdles to overcome, but the message was clear. This was a serious effort to address a real problem, and the results were beginning to show. Even the most vocal critics were now being forced to reconsider their stance. Some began to voice cautious support, while others chose to remain silent, unsure of how to respond to the tide of public approval. In a rare moment of reflection, Trump addressed the nation in a televised speech. He stood at the podium, his expression somber but resolute. Behind him, a banner displayed the words, "A new beginning for America's homeless." "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice steady, "today marks a pivotal moment in our country's history. For too long, we've turned a blind eye to the most vulnerable among us. We've watched as millions of people struggled to survive on the streets, without hope, without a future." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "But today, we're changing that. Together, we're building a future where no one is left behind. We're offering second chances, not just for the homeless, but for all of us, to remember that we are a nation built on compassion, opportunity, and the belief that everyone deserves a shot at a better life." Trump's voice grew stronger as he continued. "This initiative is just the beginning. It will take time, and it will take all of us working together to make it a reality. But I promise you, we will not stop until every person in this country has the opportunity to rebuild their life." As Trump delivered his speech, he couldn't help but reflect on the personal journey that had led him to this moment. He thought back to the alley in New York, the day he first met Sarah, the homeless woman whose story had ignited this entire movement. Her voice, filled with both pain and hope, had sparked something inside him. Her struggles had mirrored the struggles of so many others, and he realized that the solution wasn't just about providing shelter. It was about addressing the root causes of homelessness, about offering people the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. For Trump, this wasn't just a political issue. It was a deeply personal one. He had seen firsthand how the initiative had transformed people's lives. He had met countless individuals who had gone from living on the streets to finding stable employment, gaining access to health care, and reuniting with their families. He had witnessed the power of hope, and it was a force stronger than any political opposition. But even as he stood there, basking in the victory of the Senate vote, Trump knew the road ahead would not be easy. The initiative had passed, but the real challenge was in the implementation. The country had never seen a program of this magnitude before, and there were still countless hurdles to overcome. The work of rebuilding America's broken systems would be long and difficult. Still, Trump remained resolute. He had fought for this cause, and he was prepared to keep fighting, because the stakes were too high and the need for change too urgent. The Senate vote had been a turning point, but it was also a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight. Trump knew that the success of his homelessness initiative would depend not just on legislation and funding, but on the hearts and minds of the American people. He needed them to believe, just as he did, that everyone deserved a second chance. As he sat down to dinner that evening, surrounded by members of his team, Trump took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. The initiative had started as a bold vision, a hope for change. But now, it had grown into something much larger, a movement that was reshaping the way America thought about homelessness and poverty. The next chapter of his journey was just beginning, and as he looked around the table at those who had supported him from the start, he knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead, he was ready for whatever came next. The victory in the Senate had marked a significant milestone, but it was clear to Trump and his team that the hardest part was still to come. With the program approved and the funding secured, the next challenge was the on-the-ground implementation. Across the country, cities were beginning to open new shelters, create job training programs, and offer mental health services to those in need. But while the plan was ambitious, there was a pressing question. Would it really work in the long term? In New York City, where Trump's journey had begun, the first of the new shelters opened its doors. The facility, a sprawling, clean building nestled in a quieter part of the city, was a far cry from the overcrowded, often unsanitary shelters that many homeless people had come to expect. It was equipped with dormitory-style rooms, access to health services, and a variety of vocational training programs. But it wasn't just the physical amenities that made this shelter different. It was the philosophy behind it. "This isn't a handout. It's a hand up," Sarah said as she stood with Trump at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, watching the first residents of the shelter file in. "We're not just providing shelter. We're giving them a chance to rebuild their lives." As she spoke, the camera zoomed in on the faces of the people who had just walked through the doors. Young men and women, some of them with children, others who appeared older and weathered by years on the streets. There was a mixture of emotions: hope, trepidation, and in some cases, disbelief. Could this really be the opportunity they had been waiting for? Could a government program, even with all its flaws, truly change their lives? Trump, standing beside Sarah, watched them with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had always been a man of action, but seeing it all come to life, seeing the impact of his vision, brought a sense of fulfillment that words couldn't capture. But as the weeks passed, the challenges of implementation became evident. Not every city had the resources or the infrastructure to manage the shelters and programs effectively. While some regions, like San Francisco and Chicago, were thriving with innovative job placement and rehabilitation programs, others, like Detroit and Miami, faced significant roadblocks. In Detroit, for example, a series of bureaucratic delays and lack of trained staff had delayed the opening of a critical shelter. The homeless population in the area was large, and the waiting list for services had grown to alarming proportions. Trump, frustrated with the setbacks, called a meeting with his staff to discuss how to expedite the process. "We can't afford delays like this," Trump said, pacing back and forth in the conference room. "People are depending on us. We promised them a new beginning, and if we don't deliver, we lose everything." Sarah, always calm under pressure, stepped in. "We need to make sure that the systems are ready before we open the doors. It's not enough to just put a roof over their heads. We need the support systems in place: mental health services, job training, addiction counseling. Otherwise, we're just setting them up to fail." Trump looked at her, considering her words. "You're right. We need to do it right, even if it takes a little longer. To understand the real impact of his initiative, Trump decided to visit some of the shelters personally. He had always been a man of big plans, but he had never truly understood the complexities of homelessness on such a personal level. He had visited shelters in the past, but those were photo opportunities, staged events. This time was different. He wanted to meet the people, hear their stories, and truly grasp the challenges they faced. One cold morning, Trump arrived at a shelter in the heart of Philadelphia. It was a modest building, not as polished as the New York shelter, but it was functional. He was escorted through the facility by Karen, a no-nonsense social worker who had been with the program since its inception. As they walked through the halls, Trump was struck by the range of people in the shelter. There were young mothers, men in their 40s, a few veterans, and even a group of teenagers. Some sat in the common area watching TV. Others chatted quietly, while others were in line for food. Trump was taken aback by how normal they all seemed. He had always assumed that homelessness was something that happened to other people, those who had made poor choices or fallen victim to circumstances beyond their control. But as he spoke to these individuals, he realized that for many of them, their stories were complicated, deep-rooted issues of addiction, mental health struggles, loss of family support, and the lack of affordable housing. One woman, named Janelle, stood out in particular. She was in her early 30s, with a kind face and eyes that seemed both weary and hopeful. Janelle had been homeless for nearly 5 years after losing her job and then being diagnosed with a mental health condition that made it impossible to keep a job. "I've tried everything," Janelle told Trump as they sat down in a small office. "I've been to shelters before. I've been to rehab. I've tried to get my life together, but it always feels like 2 steps forward, 5 steps back." Trump listened intently, his face serious. "I hear you, Janelle, and I understand how hard this is. But we're going to keep pushing. We won't stop. You don't have to go through this alone." Janelle gave a small, uncertain smile. "I don't know if I believe that yet, but I'm willing to try." As the program continued to expand, the ripple effect of the initiative began to reach further than anyone had anticipated. Local businesses started to embrace the idea of hiring those coming out of shelters. Nonprofits and community organizations that had once been fragmented now found themselves working together in ways they never had before. In Los Angeles, a local tech startup partnered with the shelter system to create an internship program for homeless individuals who had completed job training. The company's CEO, Ryan Blackwell, a former skeptic of Trump's initiative, had been won over by the stories of transformation he had witnessed firsthand. "People think homelessness is just about not having a place to live," Ryan said in an interview. "But it's deeper than that. It's about a lack of opportunity, a lack of connection. When we started bringing these people into our offices, we saw their potential. They just needed a chance." Across the country, communities were starting to see the power of collaboration. And as the initiative grew, so did its potential for long-term success. People who had been forgotten, ignored, and dismissed were now seen as valuable members of society. For Trump, the visits to the shelters were more than just a means of checking on the progress of the program. They were a profound personal journey. He began to understand the complexities of homelessness not just from a political or economic standpoint, but from a deeply human one. He spent late nights reflecting on what he had learned. It was no longer just about passing legislation or building shelters. It was about changing the culture around homelessness, about fostering empathy and understanding. And he knew that if he truly wanted to make a difference, he would have to continue listening, continue learning, and continue fighting for those who had been forgotten. Despite the early successes, Trump and his team knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The homeless population in America was vast, and while the initiative was making strides, there was still much work to be done. Every city, every shelter, and every individual was a new challenge. The country was watching closely, waiting to see if this bold vision would succeed, or if it would falter under the weight of its own ambition. But for Trump, there was no turning back. He had made a promise, to the homeless, to the American people, and to himself, and he intended to keep it. As the homeless initiative continued to grow, not every city saw immediate success. While some areas experienced significant positive change, others struggled with the weight of implementation. The real test came in Chicago, where rising crime rates, overcrowded shelters, and strained social services created a perfect storm of challenges. The city's homeless population was one of the largest in the country, and with limited resources, the initiative faced its greatest test yet. Trump had spent much of his time celebrating the successes of the initiative in cities like New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. But he knew that the real challenge lay in areas like Chicago, where systemic issues, political tension, and deep social divides created a complex environment for the homeless. "I've got to see it for myself," Trump said, standing in front of his team in the Oval Office. "We need to figure out what's going wrong in places like Chicago and make sure we're getting it right." Sarah, ever the strategist, agreed. "The shelters are overwhelmed. There's been a rise in violence, and there aren't enough mental health professionals to handle the load. We need a multifaceted solution, more than just beds and food." Trump nodded, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He had always been a hands-on leader, someone who didn't shy away from tough situations. He knew that if he was going to make a real difference, he had to understand the full scope of the problem. When Trump arrived in Chicago, the mood was tense. The shelter he visited, located in one of the city's most poverty-stricken neighborhoods, was overcrowded and underfunded. Volunteers worked tirelessly, but they were stretched thin. Many of the homeless were dealing with not just the trauma of living on the streets, but also addiction, mental illness, and a lack of job prospects. Trump's visit began with a tour of the shelter. The facility was clean but small, and as he walked through the common area, the stories of struggle were clear on the faces of the people there. A young man named Derek, who had been homeless for 3 years, spoke to Trump about his experiences. His voice was steady but full of pain. "I've been trying to get into rehab for months, but the waiting list is long," Derek explained. "I don't have the energy to fight the system anymore. It feels like no one cares." Trump, listening intently, felt a lump form in his throat. Derek's words struck him deeply. It was one thing to see the statistics. It was another to look someone in the eye and hear the hopelessness in their voice. "I promise you, Derek, we're going to fix this," Trump said, his voice resolute. "We're going to make sure you and people like you don't have to wait in line for help anymore." That evening, Trump held a meeting with local leaders, social workers, and members of his administration to assess the situation. The data was grim. Chicago had one of the highest rates of homelessness in the country, and the shelters were overwhelmed. But what concerned Trump the most was the rise in crime and violence in the homeless communities. Reports had been coming in from police and local nonprofits about escalating gang activity in areas where the homeless congregated. Opportunistic criminals were exploiting the vulnerable, and many of the people in shelters were becoming victims of theft, assault, and even murder. "You've got to understand, Mr. President," said Lieutenant James O'Connor, a local police officer, "the streets aren't just dangerous because of the weather or lack of shelter. There are real dangers, organized crime, drugs, and violence that we need to address. It's not just about giving people food and a place to stay. It's about protecting them from harm." Trump nodded, taking it all in. "We need more than just social services. We need security. We need safety. We need to partner with law enforcement to make sure these people aren't sitting ducks." In the days that followed, Trump and his team worked tirelessly to come up with a new plan for Chicago, one that addressed both the immediate needs of the homeless and the systemic issues that were causing the crisis. It was clear that the initiative needed a more integrated approach, one that combined shelter, mental health services, job training, addiction treatment, and law enforcement. Sarah, with her background in strategy and social policy, was instrumental in crafting the new framework. "We need a network of services," she said, "one that doesn't just focus on the symptoms of homelessness but addresses the root causes: addiction, mental illness, poverty, and lack of job opportunities. It's going to take a full-scale effort." The new plan called for increased collaboration between the city's police force, social services, and local businesses. It proposed specialized outreach teams that would not only connect people with shelters and services, but also offer case management to help people find long-term stability. Law enforcement would be involved, but in a supportive capacity, ensuring that people were safe and not exploited while also cracking down on the criminal elements that preyed on the homeless. Trump authorized additional funding for mental health programs and addiction services, and he pushed for an increase in the number of social workers trained to handle trauma cases. Amid the chaos and meetings, Trump made time to sit down with Janice, a woman in her mid-40s who had spent the last 6 months in and out of the shelter system. Janice had lost her job at a call center after her company downsized, and shortly after, she was evicted from her apartment. She had tried to get back on her feet, but without a reliable support system, she had fallen through the cracks. "I've been to shelters before," Janice said, her voice soft but steady. "But they don't feel like they're for people like me. They feel like holding cells. No one really wants to help. They just want us off the streets." Trump listened closely. "Janice, I promise you, we're going to change that. We want to make sure this isn't just a place to survive. It's a place to rebuild." In the weeks that followed, the implementation of the new plan began to show results. Law enforcement worked closely with outreach teams to ensure safety around shelters, and the addition of caseworkers and mental health professionals allowed for more personalized, hands-on care. Chicago's shelters were no longer places of desperation. They were becoming hubs of transformation. Janice, who had been uncertain at first, began to see progress. With the support of the new initiative, she entered a job training program and started therapy for her anxiety and depression. Derek, who had been on the waiting list for rehab, finally got a spot in a treatment center, and his path to recovery began. Though the crisis in Chicago was far from over, Trump felt a glimmer of hope. The solution wasn't simple, and it wasn't quick, but it was starting to work. For the first time in a long time, he could see the tangible effects of his initiative. Despite the successes, Trump's critics were relentless. His initiative, while praised by some, was also being attacked by those who saw it as an overreach of government power. Critics argued that the program was too costly, that it lacked accountability, and that it didn't address the root causes of homelessness in a sustainable way. In Chicago, some local politicians, feeling the pressure of their own constituents, began to distance themselves from the program, saying that more needed to be done to address crime and unemployment in the city before focusing on homelessness. The political opposition was fierce, but Trump was undeterred. "I didn't get into this to win popularity contests," Trump told his team. "I got into this because it's the right thing to do. We're not backing down now." With the momentum from Chicago's renewed approach to homelessness, Trump's initiative began to see real, measurable success in other cities as well. What had started as a lofty idea, fraught with skepticism and uncertainty, was beginning to take shape as a beacon of hope for many who had long been forgotten by society. The first signs of real transformation were being seen in people who had once lost all hope. As the program expanded across the nation, Trump's initiative began to attract unexpected allies. Local business owners, often skeptical of government programs, started partnering with shelters to create opportunities for job training and employment. Nonprofits that had been working for years in the trenches of homelessness were now being brought into the fold, with government support. And perhaps most surprisingly, the initiative was winning the approval of people who had previously been adamantly opposed to Trump's policies. One of these new allies was Lisa Harper, a progressive activist who had spent years organizing efforts to combat homelessness. She had initially viewed Trump's intervention with deep suspicion. However, after seeing the tangible changes in cities like San Francisco, she decided to visit one of the new shelters in Los Angeles. When Lisa arrived at the shelter, she found a scene she had never expected. Instead of the usual chaotic environment she had come to associate with government-run shelters, there was a sense of order and purpose. People were receiving job training, addiction counseling, and even educational opportunities. The staff seemed committed, not just to providing temporary relief, but to offering a sustainable path forward. Lisa spoke with residents of the shelter, hearing their stories of how the initiative had changed their lives. One man, Greg, had been living on the streets for over a decade before being placed in the shelter and enrolled in a job training program. He was now working part-time at a local cafe, with plans to start his own small business. "This is the first time in years that I've felt like I have a future," Greg said, his eyes bright with hope. "I didn't think it was possible, but now I'm getting my life back." Lisa was moved by Greg's story. She realized that despite her political differences with Trump, the initiative had created real, positive change. It wasn't perfect, no system ever was, but it was working. Back in Washington, Trump received regular updates from his team on the progress of the initiative. But it wasn't until he met with a man named Paul, who had been living on the streets of Los Angeles for years, that he truly understood the power of personal transformation. Paul's story was one of both heartbreak and triumph. He had grown up in a working-class family in rural Pennsylvania, but had fallen into substance abuse after the death of his mother. Eventually, his addiction led to the loss of his job, his home, and his family. For years, he drifted from one shelter to another, unable to break free from the cycle of poverty and addiction. But after enrolling in one of the new rehabilitation programs offered through the initiative, Paul's life began to change. The shelter wasn't just a place for him to sleep. It was a place where he could receive counseling, learn new skills, and receive the emotional support he needed to confront his demons. "I didn't believe it at first," Paul confessed to Trump in an emotional meeting. "I thought I was too far gone. But this place, it's different. It's given me a reason to try again." Paul had recently completed the rehabilitation program and was now working as a counselor at the same shelter that had helped him. His journey had come full circle, and he was now using his own experiences to guide others who were struggling with the same issues. One of the critical aspects of the initiative was its emphasis on community involvement. Unlike traditional government programs, which often operated in isolation, Trump's initiative encouraged collaboration between local businesses, nonprofits, law enforcement, and the homeless themselves. This approach fostered a sense of shared responsibility, and it quickly became clear that it wasn't just the homeless people who were being transformed, it was entire communities. In Phoenix, for example, a local technology company partnered with a nearby shelter to offer coding boot camps to homeless individuals. The program quickly gained traction, and several former homeless participants found work as entry-level software developers. The company, which had previously never considered hiring people from shelters, was now one of the biggest supporters of the initiative. "I never thought I'd be hiring people who had been homeless," said Mark Turner, the CEO of the tech company. "But I've learned that talent comes from all walks of life. These people are smart, determined, and ready to work." It's been a game changer for us. While community partnerships played a key role in the initiative's success, law enforcement also had a critical part to play. In many cities, police officers who had previously been focused on arresting homeless individuals for minor infractions were now working alongside social workers to help people get into shelters and receive the services they needed. In Denver, a city with a large homeless population, police officers were being trained to identify signs of mental illness and addiction, directing people to appropriate services rather than arresting them. The approach, known as police-assisted diversion, was beginning to show results. "I used to see people on the streets and just think they were trouble," Officer Greg Morales admitted. "But now, I understand that they need help, not punishment. I've seen people turn their lives around, and it's changed the way I look at this issue." Despite the growing successes, the initiative faced significant political pushback. Critics from both sides of the aisle began to question the long-term sustainability of the program, and some conservative voices argued that the initiative was too costly and inefficient. Meanwhile, some liberal activists felt that the program didn't go far enough to address the underlying causes of homelessness, such as affordable housing and income inequality. In Washington, these debates reached a boiling point as the next budget cycle approached. Trump's opponents in Congress began to demand cuts to the program, claiming that it wasn't delivering results quickly enough and that funds could be better spent elsewhere. Trump, as always, wasn't one to back down from a fight. "I won't let this program fail," he said in a heated exchange with his advisors. "We're going to keep pushing forward. If they want to cut the budget, they can try. But I'm not going to let politics stand in the way of helping people." Sarah, ever the pragmatist, knew that the political battles were far from over. "We've got the public on our side," she said, "but we've got to keep making the case. We've got to show that this is working and that it's worth every penny." Despite the challenges, the movement behind the homeless initiative continued to grow. People who had once been skeptical of Trump's leadership were beginning to rally behind the cause, recognizing that homelessness was not a partisan issue. It was a human issue. Across the country, communities were coming together, and the program was having a real impact on the lives of thousands of people. In Los Angeles, Sarah met with a group of former homeless individuals who had recently been hired at local businesses through the program. They spoke about how the initiative had not only given them a second chance at life, but it had also given them a renewed sense of purpose. "We've all been through hell," one of the men, Carlos, said. But this program, it's like a light at the end of the tunnel. I never thought I'd be sitting here, talking to you with a job and a future. As Sarah listened to Carlos's words, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had come so far, but the journey was far from over. There were still countless others who needed help, but for the first time in a long time, she felt confident that they could make a lasting difference. As the homeless initiative gained traction across the country, Trump faced a personal crossroads. Despite the progress, deep political divisions and rising resistance from Congress were creating obstacles that seemed insurmountable. What had begun as a promise to improve the lives of the nation's most vulnerable was now at risk of being derailed by partisan politics and an increasingly hostile media. Yet, in the face of these challenges, Trump found himself reflecting on the very roots of the project, the lives he had witnessed change, the faces that had reminded him why it mattered, and the lessons he had learned along the way. In the months since the launch of the initiative, Trump had visited countless shelters, met hundreds of individuals, and witnessed firsthand the transformation that was happening in cities across the nation. But the emotional toll was mounting. The weight of the crisis, both the sheer scale of homelessness and the complex societal issues intertwined with it, was something he had not anticipated. Late one evening in the Oval Office, after a long series of meetings with his advisors, Trump sat alone at his desk, looking at a photograph of the woman who had started it all, Maggie, the homeless woman he had met in Chicago. The image of her face, filled with quiet strength and sorrow, had stuck with him long after that day. The power of her story had motivated him to take action, and now, months later, her legacy was helping to change the lives of thousands. But that didn't make the job any easier. In the quiet of the night, Trump found himself wrestling with doubt. He had always been a man who believed in his ability to fight through adversity, but as the pushback from his political opponents grew louder, the road ahead seemed steeper. Public opinion was divided. Some praised the initiative for its humanitarian efforts, but many of his critics continued to accuse him of wasting taxpayer money on a program they believed would never succeed. The phone rang, breaking his solitude. It was Sarah. "We've got trouble," she said without preamble. "The budget proposal's been delayed again. The opposition in Congress is gathering more momentum. They want to slash the funding for the homeless program by half." Trump clenched his jaw. "They don't get it, do they?" "No, they don't," Sarah replied. "And we need to figure out how to push back. This is the point where we either double down or back off." The political resistance was growing not just from his usual adversaries on the left, but also from members of his own party. Moderate Republicans, fearing a loss of support in their districts, were beginning to distance themselves from the program. They argued that the focus on homelessness was detracting from other critical issues, such as the economy and national security. Some even accused Trump of overstepping his role as president, arguing that social programs should be managed by local governments, not the federal government. In response, Trump took to social media, as he often did when faced with resistance. A tweet went out to his millions of followers. "Homelessness is one of the greatest challenges our country faces, and we're tackling it head-on. To those who oppose the effort, I say this. The people we're helping, those struggling on the streets, don't have the luxury of waiting. We're not backing down." The tweet went viral, with supporters praising his commitment and opponents using it as ammunition to further attack the program. The tension was palpable, and the battle in Congress grew fiercer. In the midst of this political warfare, a surprising figure entered the fray. Former President Bill Clinton, known for his work on poverty issues during his time in office, publicly announced his support for the initiative. In a statement to the press, he praised the program's focus on holistic solutions, mental health services, job training, and community partnerships, while encouraging bipartisan support for the effort. "I've seen firsthand how important it is to address homelessness not just with temporary solutions, but with long-term systemic change," Clinton said. "This initiative has the potential to do just that. The work being done is real, and it's making a difference." Trump, initially wary of the endorsement, quickly realized the value of having Clinton's backing. It was a rare moment of cross-party unity that could shift the narrative in the media. Yet, even with Clinton's support, the battle in Congress was far from over. In the midst of these political challenges, Trump's resolve was tested again during a visit to Boston. He had been invited to speak at a conference on homelessness, and while there, he visited a local shelter that had become a model for the initiative. The shelter had transformed from a place of despair into a thriving community resource thanks to the funding and programs provided by the initiative. But it was one individual who would leave a lasting impact on him. As Trump toured the shelter, he met a woman named Susan, a former lawyer who had lost everything due to an alcohol addiction. Susan's story was tragic. She had been a successful attorney with a promising career until her life spiraled out of control after her father's sudden death. She turned to alcohol as a way to cope, and before long, she lost her job, her home, and her family. For years, she had been living on the streets, unable to break free from the cycle of addiction and shame. When Trump spoke with her, she explained how the shelter had not just provided her with food and shelter, but had given her the tools to rebuild her life. Through a combination of addiction counseling, legal aid, and job placement programs, Susan had been able to regain her sobriety and was now working as a counselor at the very shelter that had once been her refuge. "It wasn't easy," Susan said, her voice trembling with emotion, "but this program gave me a chance when no one else would. I didn't think I could make it, but now, I'm here, helping others. I owe everything to this initiative." Trump was deeply moved by Susan's story. It was moments like these that reminded him of why he had started this journey. He knew that the road ahead would be hard, but the impact was undeniable. People were changing their lives, one step at a time, and that was worth fighting for. Back in Washington, however, the political divide was only widening. Republicans and Democrats dug in their heels, each blaming the other for the nation's failures. Many GOP members accused Trump of using the homelessness initiative as a distraction from the more pressing issues of the economy and national security, while some Democrats argued that the program wasn't doing enough to tackle the structural problems that created homelessness in the first place. "The initiative is a start," said Senator Elizabeth Warren, a staunch critic of Trump's policies. "But it's not enough. Until we tackle the root causes, affordable housing, living wages, and a stronger social safety net, this program will remain a Band-Aid." But Trump remained unshaken. "We've got to start somewhere," he countered in a press conference. "You can't solve everything at once. But we're making progress, and that's what matters." Despite the fierce political opposition, Trump's resolve was clear. He wasn't about to let the naysayers derail the initiative that had begun to show real promise. The pushback only reinforced his belief that they were on the right path. The resistance in Washington did not go unnoticed by the American public. For many, the debate over the program underscored the stark divisions in the country. Yet, in communities across the nation, the homeless initiative was becoming a movement, one that transcended politics. Local leaders, grassroots organizations, and even private citizens were rallying around the cause, working together to address homelessness in their own neighborhoods. In cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Miami, local businesses and community organizations were stepping up, creating new programs to help homeless individuals reintegrate into society. In Los Angeles, former homeless residents who had benefited from the initiative were starting their own nonprofit organizations, determined to help others who had been in their position. Though the political fight in Washington continued, the initiative was beginning to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just Trump's project, it was a national effort, driven by the people who had experienced homelessness firsthand. The rising momentum of the homeless initiative had become undeniable, but the political pushback was starting to take a heavy toll. Trump found himself at a critical juncture, not just for the future of the program, but for his own legacy. As the initiative continued to evolve, an unexpected crisis emerged that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. It was a moment that tested not just the strength of the project, but the trust between the American people and their president. It started with an investigation, a news report that uncovered troubling financial mismanagement within one of the key nonprofit partners involved in the initiative. The report claimed that millions of dollars allocated to the homeless program had been misused, funneled into administrative overhead instead of reaching the people who needed it most. The allegations were explosive, and they immediately sent shockwaves through the media and political circles. The news hit the airwaves like a bombshell. For the first time, Trump and his team were forced to confront a major scandal related to the initiative. "I've heard the reports," Trump said to his staff as they gathered in the Oval Office. "But we can't let this derail everything we've built. We need to fix this, and we need to fix it fast. Sarah's face was pale with concern. This is going to be a problem, sir. If it's true, and it looks like there's a lot of evidence pointing that way, the public trust is at risk. People will start questioning the entire program. Do we know how bad it is? Trump asked, his tone sharp. We're still investigating, Sarah replied. But it's not just about the financials. It's about perception. If people start thinking that we're mismanaging these funds, that will undermine everything. The report mentioned a key figure, a high-ranking official from one of the nonprofit organizations, a man named David Thompson, who had been responsible for overseeing the disbursement of funds in the West Coast regions. According to the investigation, Thompson had been using the initiative's funding for personal expenses, including luxury travel and high-end dining, while claiming that it was necessary for networking and outreach. For Trump, it was a bitter blow. He had placed his trust in people, believing that they shared his vision of compassion and pragmatism. Now, this scandal threatened to undo not only his reputation but the credibility of the initiative itself. In the wake of the scandal, the media frenzy was overwhelming. Critics from both sides of the political spectrum, those who had supported the initiative and those who had opposed it, seized on the opportunity to call for a full investigation. It wasn't just about one man's wrongdoing anymore. The entire program was under suspicion. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Trump addressed the nation, his voice firm but tinged with frustration. There's a lot of noise out there right now, and I understand why. This is serious. I've always said that transparency and accountability are the bedrock of any program. I'm committed to making sure that the truth comes out. If anyone has abused the system, they will be held accountable, no exceptions. Despite his assurances, the damage to the initiative's reputation was done. Trust in the program eroded almost overnight. For many Americans, the scandal confirmed their worst fears, that the government, no matter how well-intentioned, couldn't handle such a complex issue. People began to question if this was just another example of wasteful spending, another initiative doomed to fail. In Washington, the political knives came out. Senators and House representatives who had once been allies of the initiative now demanded investigations. Some went as far as to propose drastic cuts to the program's funding, while others called for an immediate halt to the entire operation until a full audit could be conducted. For Trump, the scandal was deeply personal. He had started this initiative with a genuine desire to help people, to make a real difference in the lives of the most vulnerable Americans. The idea of it being tainted by corruption was almost too much to bear. It felt like a betrayal, not just of his trust, but of the very people he had promised to help. He spent long hours alone, pacing the halls of the White House, thinking back on his meeting with Maggie in Chicago, the woman who had inspired him to act in the first place. What would she think of all this? What about the hundreds of others who had benefited from the program? It wasn't just the homeless that had been impacted. This was now a crisis of trust that would ripple through every facet of the initiative. Every success, every breakthrough, felt overshadowed by the corruption scandal. The faces of the people who had changed their lives with the help of the program seemed distant now, fading beneath the overwhelming weight of the scandal. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, remained hopeful. "We can get through this," she said, looking at Trump from across the room. "But we need to act fast. We need to get ahead of this story, control the narrative, and show the American people that this program is still worth saving." Trump nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "How do we do that?" "We need a full, independent audit of every nonprofit and partner involved in the initiative," Sarah said. "We need to be transparent, show that we're committed to rooting out any corruption. If we do that, we'll regain trust. But it's going to take time." It wasn't the easy solution Trump had hoped for, but it was the only one that would allow the initiative to survive. He knew that the road ahead would be rocky, but he couldn't back down now, not after everything that had been accomplished. The investigation into David Thompson and the nonprofit organization quickly expanded, uncovering more details about financial mismanagement, though it remained unclear whether the corruption had been widespread or confined to a few individuals. Thompson was arrested, and the media covered every detail of the scandal, making it impossible for the public to ignore. However, as the weeks passed, the truth began to emerge. Yes, there had been corruption, but it was not indicative of the initiative as a whole. The vast majority of the partners involved in the program were working diligently to help those in need. Many shelters, job training centers, and rehabilitation programs were continuing their work without incident. The public began to understand that while mistakes had been made, they did not negate the real progress that had been achieved. Trump knew that in order to restore faith in the initiative, he would have to take full responsibility for the scandal. On a Thursday evening, in a rare live address, Trump stood before the American people. "This has been a tough time for everyone involved," he began, his voice steady but solemn. "I promise you, we will not stand for corruption. If anyone has abused the system, they will face the consequences. But we also need to remember that the true purpose of this program is to help people, and that mission is as important as ever." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I understand that we've lost some trust, but I ask for your faith that we will continue this fight, faith that together we can make a difference." Trump's public apology did not immediately solve the crisis, but it marked a turning point. The media began to focus less on the scandal and more on the people whose lives had been changed by the initiative. Stories of recovery, redemption, and success began to re-enter the news cycle, reminding Americans that while the program was not perfect, it was still making a profound impact. In Los Angeles, a former addict named David was now working as a chef at a local restaurant. He had been homeless for years, living in and out of shelters. But thanks to the job training program funded by the initiative, David had turned his life around. "I used to think I'd never get out," he told reporters. "But this program, it gave me a chance to rebuild. And now, I'm here, making something of myself." David's story, and others like it, began to drown out the noise of the scandal. Slowly but surely, the initiative regained its footing and public support began to rise once again. It was clear now. The road ahead would not be easy, and the obstacles were far from over. But Trump had learned a crucial lesson. True progress was never without its setbacks. And no matter how many times you stumbled, the most important thing was to keep moving forward. The storm over the scandal was beginning to subside, but its effects lingered. Despite regaining some measure of public confidence, Trump knew that the real work was just beginning. The American people had always been quick to forgive a leader who owned up to his mistakes, but they also demanded results. The homeless initiative had been restored, but it was not yet secure in its place in the national consciousness. To solidify its future, Trump needed not only to restore faith, but to prove the program's value with tangible outcomes. And it was in this moment, when the pressure seemed the highest, that Trump found an unexpected ally. It was a late evening in the White House when Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the number and blinked, surprised. It was Bill Clinton's office. "Mr. Clinton wants to meet with the president," Sarah said, her voice betraying a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Bill Clinton? What does he want?" Trump asked, surprised. After his public endorsement of the initiative months ago, Trump hadn't heard much from the former president. But in the wake of the scandal, Clinton's voice had been conspicuously absent. "He didn't say," Sarah replied, "but he wants to discuss the homeless program. He feels it's important." After a brief moment of contemplation, Trump agreed. "Set it up. Let's see what he has to say." A few days later, Bill Clinton arrived at the White House for a private meeting. As they sat in the Oval Office, Trump couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Clinton was a seasoned political strategist, a former president with decades of experience, and someone who had built a reputation for tackling tough social issues. The initiative to combat homelessness was a cause Clinton knew well, and Trump understood that his support would be invaluable, if only Clinton could be convinced that the program was worth his time. "I know things have been rough," Clinton began, after a moment of pleasantries, "but I also know you're committed to the cause. I'm here because I think there's a way forward." Trump leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I appreciate that, Bill. But after everything that's happened, I'm not sure where we go from here. The scandal knocked us off course. I'm trying to keep things afloat, but I need help. I need people who believe in this." Clinton smiled knowingly. "I believe in it, Don. But you need to make it clear that you're in it for the long haul. The American people want results. They want to see something tangible. I've been doing that. I've been pushing for results. But the corruption scandal, it's hard to shake. And now, people are starting to second-guess whether the program is really making a difference." Clinton nodded, understanding the frustration. That's politics, my friend. But let's think about it this way. The initiative you've launched, this isn't just about helping the homeless. It's about changing the culture around poverty, addiction, and mental health. That's a monumental shift, and it's going to take time. After hours of discussion, Clinton laid out a bold proposal, a national summit on homelessness. The idea was simple but powerful: bring together experts, activists, and local leaders from across the nation to discuss solutions, share successes, and align their efforts. The summit would be a way for Trump to publicly reaffirm his commitment to the initiative while showcasing the tangible progress that had already been made. We need to shift the conversation, Clinton said. The scandal is one thing, but the story here is the people who are succeeding. The businesses, the shelters, the local governments, all of them working together to make real change. You need to use this summit to highlight those victories. Trump was skeptical. It sounds good, but will it work? Will it bring people back on our side? It will if you make it personal, Clinton replied. The American people need to know that this program is something you believe in, not just for political reasons, but because you understand its importance. You can't do that from behind a desk in the Oval Office. You need to be out there, in the trenches, showing up for these people. That's how you win back trust. Trump was silent for a moment, reflecting on Clinton's words. It was a radical shift in strategy, but perhaps it was what he needed. He had always been known for his big rallies and public appearances. If he could turn the summit into an event that showcased real success stories and painted a picture of the future, it could change the conversation entirely. The National Summit on Homelessness was set for the following month. It would take place in Washington, D.C., but it was designed to be far more than a series of speeches and policy discussions. Trump's team worked tirelessly to ensure that the event would spotlight individuals whose lives had been transformed by the initiative. Former homeless people who were now living in stable homes, receiving education or job training, and contributing to their communities. They reached out to local shelters, nonprofits, and state governments, hoping to bring them to Washington to share their stories. Trump's team also worked with Clinton's office to coordinate the logistics of the event, which would include a series of panel discussions, workshops, and media opportunities. The summit would be covered live by news networks across the country, and its success would be measured not just by the people who attended, but by the stories they brought with them. The day of the summit arrived, and the atmosphere in Washington was electric. Media trucks lined the streets, while protesters, both for and against the initiative, gathered outside the Capitol. Inside, the summit was being set up like a high-profile convention, with various sections dedicated to different topics: mental health, addiction recovery, job placement, and affordable housing. Trump entered the main hall to loud applause, accompanied by Clinton and other key supporters. The event was being broadcast live, and millions of Americans were tuning in to watch. "I'm proud to be here today," Trump began his opening remarks, standing at the podium. "What we're doing here is more than just policy. It's about people's lives. It's about real, lasting change. And that's why I'm here, not as a politician, but as someone who believes in the future we can build together." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "We've had our challenges, but I know this: every step forward is a step closer to a solution. And together, we can make a real difference." As the summit unfolded, it became clear that this was more than just a political event. The success stories shared by former homeless individuals were powerful, each one highlighting not only the systemic problems that led to their homelessness, but also the personal determination that had allowed them to break free from the cycle of despair. One story in particular stood out. Emma, a young woman who had struggled with addiction and homelessness for years before joining a rehabilitation program funded by the initiative. Now clean, she was working as a social worker, helping others who had been in her shoes. "I was lost," Emma said, her voice trembling as she spoke to the crowd. "But now, I have a future. This program gave me a chance to prove myself. And I'm here today to show that I'm not the only one. There are thousands like me." Trump watched from the stage, feeling a surge of pride. This was the reason he had started the program, to give people like Emma a chance. And as the summit continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about political promises, it was about changing lives. Clinton's strategy had worked. The summit was being hailed as a success by the media, and public opinion began to shift. People were beginning to see that the homeless initiative was not just a government handout. It was a genuine, multifaceted effort to solve one of the country's most pressing issues. For Trump, the summit marked a new chapter in his journey, a step forward toward redemption, not just for the initiative, but for himself. The National Summit on Homelessness had done more than just salvage the reputation of the initiative. It had sparked a nationwide conversation about the real solutions to homelessness. What was once a highly contentious issue, mired in political debates and partisan bickering, now had a renewed sense of urgency and focus. But while the summit had brought the issue into the public eye, Trump and his team knew that the hard work was far from over. The real challenge lay in making the momentum from the summit translate into lasting, tangible change on the ground. In the weeks following the summit, the American public's perception of the homeless initiative began to shift. Polls showed a marked increase in support for the program, particularly among people who had been skeptical or opposed in the past. Many now saw the initiative not as a failed government project, but as an earnest attempt to solve a deeply ingrained problem. The stories shared during the summit, the emotional testimonies of individuals who had been given a second chance, resonated with Americans across the political spectrum. It wasn't just the speeches that made a difference. It was the people themselves. Emma's story, in particular, had captured hearts nationwide. Her transformation from a homeless addict to a successful social worker was a symbol of what the program could accomplish. People are starting to believe in it again, Sarah said, reviewing the post-summit data with Trump in the Oval Office. This is the kind of turnaround we needed. Trump nodded, but his face remained serious. We can't afford to lose focus. We need to make sure we're building on this momentum. If we fail now, everything will fall apart again. The renewed public support didn't mean the political challenges were over. While Trump had won back some of his allies in Congress after the summit, others were still wary of the initiative's long-term sustainability. Critics continued to point to the scandal, and some of the same politicians who had supported the program in the beginning were now questioning its cost-effectiveness. Senator Laura Evans, a key figure in the Senate who had been a vocal supporter of the program, met with Trump in the White House. Though she still backed the initiative, she had concerns about the budget. "Don," she began, "I believe in what you're doing. I really do. But the public needs to see results. They need to know that the money is being spent wisely. You've got to get the financial side under control. If we don't, we'll lose the support we've worked so hard to gain." Trump listened carefully. "I know, Laura. We're doing everything we can. But this isn't just about the numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about real people. People who've been forgotten for too long. We can't lose sight of that." Laura nodded. "I understand. But you've got to be realistic. At some point, the public will want to see concrete evidence that the program is working. We need benchmarks, metrics, something to show them that this isn't just a political talking point." With the pressure mounting, Trump's team began to develop a detailed roadmap for the next phase of the initiative. They decided to focus on 3 primary goals that would define the next year of the program. 1. Building sustainable housing. The initiative had made strides in providing temporary shelters, but there was a pressing need for long-term, affordable housing solutions. They aimed to construct modular homes in cities across the country, creating self-sustaining communities for people transitioning out of homelessness. 2. Job training and placement programs. One of the most successful components of the initiative had been the job training programs. But now they needed to expand and fine-tune these programs, ensuring that participants were not only prepared for work, but also placed in positions that offered meaningful career paths. 3. Mental health and addiction services. Mental health and addiction were at the core of the homelessness crisis, and Trump was determined to make sure that the initiative provided comprehensive support in these areas. This meant expanding access to counseling, therapy, and rehabilitation programs. As Sarah and the team mapped out these goals, they understood that success would depend on collaboration with local governments, nonprofits, and businesses. Public-private partnerships would be crucial, as would transparent, accountable management of funds. The key to the initiative's survival was to prove, beyond any doubt, that it could be both compassionate and effective. The first major step in the initiative's reboot was the construction of the first of many new modular homes in a pilot city, Charlotte, North Carolina. These homes were designed to be affordable, energy efficient, and quick to assemble. They provided a stable living environment for people who had spent years moving between shelters or living on the streets. The homes were located on a former industrial site that had been repurposed into a small, thriving community. Maggie, the woman who had started it all in Chicago, had been appointed as the program's director of housing solutions. She worked tirelessly with architects, local leaders, and business owners to turn the vision into reality. Watching the first families move into their new homes was a powerful moment, one that reminded Trump and his team why they had begun this journey in the first place. "Look at this," Trump said during a visit to Charlotte, standing in front of a newly completed cluster of homes. "This is real. This is what we're here for." Maggie smiled. "This is just the beginning." The homes provided not only a roof but also access to services, job placement, mental health counseling, and education. Within months, many of the residents found stable jobs in local businesses, while others went back to school to earn their GEDs or attend community college. For many, the new housing was the first step toward rebuilding their lives. Despite the early successes, there were still hurdles. Some cities faced resistance to the program, citing zoning issues or local opposition to the construction of new housing units. Others struggled with the lack of available jobs or the need for additional mental health services. In some areas, the level of addiction and trauma was so deep that simply offering a roof wasn't enough. Trump knew that these challenges could derail the program if they weren't addressed head-on. He convened a meeting with his team and outside experts to discuss these issues. They explored solutions, expanding mobile health clinics, creating more flexible job training schedules, and working with local leaders to ease zoning restrictions. One of the most difficult challenges came in Los Angeles, where the homelessness crisis had reached critical levels. Despite the program's success in other areas, Los Angeles struggled with addiction and severe mental health problems that seemed beyond the reach of the initiative. For Trump, the city was now a litmus test for the entire program. "I don't care how hard it gets," Trump said during a meeting with Sarah and Maggie. "We're not stopping. We need to find a way to help Los Angeles." In these challenging times, Trump found himself reflecting on his own personal growth. The journey from the initial scandal to the present had not been easy. He had faced criticism, endured setbacks, and experienced moments of self-doubt. Yet, through it all, he had been driven by a belief that this initiative had the potential to change lives, and in doing so, to change the very fabric of American society. One afternoon, while visiting a new homeless shelter in Baltimore, Trump had a quiet moment of reflection. He met a man named Carlos, who had been living on the streets for over a decade before entering the program. Now employed and living in one of the modular homes, Carlos shared his story. "I never thought I'd be here," Carlos said, shaking his head in disbelief. "But this program, it gave me a chance. I got my life back." As Trump looked into Carlos's eyes, he realized the enormity of what had been accomplished. And in that moment, he understood the true weight of the work he had started. It wasn't about politics or power. It was about people and helping them rise above their circumstances. The momentum from the National Summit on Homelessness had given the initiative a fresh start, but as Trump and his team knew all too well, the real test was yet to come. The American public, already skeptical of political promises, now expected results. The weeks following the summit had been filled with small successes, but the looming question remained. Could this initiative truly make a dent in the homelessness crisis, or was it just another well-intentioned program destined to fail? As the year progressed, Trump found himself under increasing pressure from both allies and critics. The initiative's early successes had garnered positive media attention, but the spotlight on it now was even more intense. It wasn't enough to have good intentions. The American people needed to see results. With midterm elections approaching, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Sarah sat down with Trump in the Oval Office one afternoon to review the latest progress reports. "Don, you've got momentum. People are starting to believe in this again. But we can't afford any more mistakes. There's too much riding on this." Trump leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "I know. I'm doing everything I can. But it feels like no matter what we do, the clock is ticking. We need a game changer. Something that'll convince the skeptics and show the nation that we're serious about this." Sarah nodded. "We need a big win. A victory that the media can't ignore." In the midst of this uncertainty, the Trump team hatched a bold new plan. The New Beginnings campaign was designed to highlight the personal stories of those who had been directly impacted by the homeless initiative. It would focus not just on the success stories, but also on the long-term, sustainable changes that were beginning to take place in communities across the nation. More importantly, the campaign would focus on one thing: hope. The idea was to bring a human element to the issue, beyond just statistics and political rhetoric. It would center around a traveling exhibition where individuals who had successfully transitioned from homelessness into stable jobs and homes would share their stories. Trump himself would make several public appearances at these events, offering his personal endorsement and urging Americans to get involved in supporting the cause. The campaign launched in Detroit, Michigan, a city that had been hit particularly hard by economic hardship. The event was held at a large convention center where a mix of local leaders, social workers, business owners, and homeless individuals gathered to celebrate the progress of the initiative. The keynote speaker at the event was Carlos, the man Trump had met in Baltimore just months earlier. Carlos had become the face of the program's success in his community. His story of overcoming addiction, finding stable housing, and rebuilding his life had inspired others to follow in his footsteps. Standing on the stage, Carlos looked out at the crowd, his hands shaking slightly but his voice strong. "I was homeless. I was broken. I thought there was no way out. But this program, this opportunity, it saved me. And if it can save me, it can save anyone." Trump, standing beside Carlos, couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He had seen firsthand the incredible transformations that had been made possible by the initiative. But hearing Carlos speak, truly speak from the heart, was a reminder of just how much was at stake. The New Beginnings campaign struck a chord with the American public. News outlets across the country covered the event in Detroit, with many stories focusing on Carlos's powerful speech. The media buzzed with positive coverage, and for the first time in months, the homeless initiative was seen in a new light, not as a failure, but as a genuine success. The focus on personal stories of transformation helped humanize the issue, shifting the narrative away from the negative press surrounding the earlier scandal. The public began to understand that this wasn't just about policies and budgets, it was about people and the possibility of redemption. The initiative wasn't perfect, but it was real. As the media frenzy around the event grew, Trump's approval ratings surged. The New Beginnings campaign had given him something far more valuable than political support. It had given him the goodwill of the American people. However, the campaign wasn't without its challenges. As successful as the launch event was, not everyone was convinced that the program was sustainable. In some cities, local officials were still hesitant to implement the program fully, either due to resource limitations or fears of backlash from constituents. In Los Angeles, the homelessness crisis had reached unprecedented levels, and despite the program's successes, many felt that the solution being offered was insufficient for such a large and complex problem. City officials argued that the modular homes, while effective in some areas, were not a one-size-fits-all solution for a city as large and diverse as Los Angeles. The idea of modular homes is fine for small towns, but here in LA, we need something bigger, said Mayor Linda Harris, a key political figure in the city. We need long-term, multifaceted solutions that include better healthcare, housing, and job opportunities. This program can't just be about putting people in homes. It's about creating real opportunities. Trump had heard this kind of criticism before, but it stung a little more this time. Los Angeles was a critical battleground for the initiative, and if he couldn't find a way to get local leaders on board, the whole program could be jeopardized. While the political winds swirled around him, Trump began to experience a personal crisis of his own. After months of pushing himself to the limit, the exhaustion was beginning to take a toll. The weight of the scandal, the pressure from his supporters and detractors alike, and the responsibility of managing a program of this magnitude was starting to wear on him. He had always prided himself on his resilience, but as the weeks wore on, the sleepless nights began to catch up with him. It was during a late-night meeting with Sarah, when he had been reflecting on the situation, that he realized just how much he had changed. "I started this to win back the American people," Trump said quietly, his voice more vulnerable than Sarah had ever heard it. "But I think somewhere along the way, I started caring about the people we're actually helping. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about all of us." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. You've always cared, Don, but now you're leading with heart. And that's why this is working. As the media buzz surrounding the campaign reached its peak, Trump knew that the time had come to face the most significant challenge yet, Los Angeles. He couldn't afford to let this city slip through his fingers. It would be a defining moment for both the initiative and his presidency. Trump made a rare decision. He would visit Los Angeles himself. With Sarah and his team in tow, he spent several days meeting with local leaders, community organizers, and homeless advocates to better understand the complexities of the situation. He listened more than he spoke, asking questions and seeking input from those who knew the issue firsthand. At the end of the trip, Trump announced a new partnership between the initiative and local governments in Los Angeles to address the unique challenges the city faced. The plan involved expanding mental health services, creating specialized housing programs for veterans and families, and increasing the number of job training programs available. It's not enough to just put a roof over people's heads, Trump said in a televised address. We need to give them the tools to build a future. And that's exactly what we're going to do. The announcement in Los Angeles marked a pivotal moment for Trump's homeless initiative. Not only did it address some of the city's most complex challenges, but it also demonstrated a shift in Trump's leadership style. What had started as a controversial political move had evolved into a deeply personal commitment to solving one of the nation's most pressing issues. Yet, even as the program gained traction, the road ahead was far from certain. The fight for lasting change was just beginning. In the months that followed the Los Angeles announcement, the momentum behind the homeless initiative surged. The new partnership in LA was hailed as a model for other cities grappling with homelessness, and similar programs began to take root in other urban centers. From New York to Houston, communities started to adopt a hybrid model of housing, job training, and mental health services that combined the successes of the national initiative with localized solutions tailored to specific needs. For Trump, these changes were proof that the program was more than just a temporary fix. It was a movement that was transforming how the nation viewed homelessness. No longer just a problem to be swept under the rug, homelessness had become a national priority. Still, challenges remained. While progress was being made in many cities, there were still communities where the initiative struggled to gain traction. In rural areas, the lack of infrastructure, healthcare, and job opportunities posed significant barriers. Smaller towns were also reluctant to embrace the program, fearing that it would drain local resources without offering substantial long-term solutions. But the stories of people like Carlos continued to spread. He had become a nationwide symbol of the program's success, frequently appearing at rallies, town halls, and interviews to share his journey. His transformation was proof that the initiative could work, not just for the individual, but for the community as a whole. The shift in public opinion was striking. A Gallup poll conducted 6 months after the launch of the New Beginnings campaign showed that public support for the homeless initiative had skyrocketed to over 70%. This wasn't just a passing trend. It was a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about poverty and homelessness. The more we see stories like Carlos's, the more we realize that these people aren't just statistics, Sarah said to Trump one afternoon as they reviewed the poll numbers. They're human beings, just like us. And now, more people are starting to believe that we can solve this. Trump sat back, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. I never imagined it would get this far, he said, but we're just getting started. As the midterm elections approached, Trump's political team faced the delicate task of balancing the positive momentum from the homeless initiative with the other pressing issues of the nation. While the initiative had gained significant support, there were still those who viewed it skeptically, particularly within the more conservative wing of the party. Some of Trump's allies, who had initially supported the initiative, began to distance themselves from it. The program's costs were mounting, and while Trump had championed the idea of long-term investment in the nation's homeless population, some critics argued that the financial burden was becoming too much to bear. Don, we've done a lot of good here, but the budget is getting out of hand, Senator Laura Evans said in a private meeting. I'm all for helping people, but there are limits. We have to balance this with the other priorities. Trump listened carefully, knowing that the balance between compassion and fiscal responsibility would be one of the most difficult aspects of the initiative moving forward. He had always believed that money could be found to solve big problems, if the will was there. But he also understood that political realities were complex. I hear you, Laura. But this isn't just about money. It's about giving people a chance to rebuild their lives. You don't put a price tag on that, Trump responded. The midterm elections would ultimately serve as a test of whether the nation believed the same. As the election season heated up, Trump found himself reflecting on how far he had come. His initial motivation to launch the homeless initiative had been political, a way to win back public trust and prove that he could lead on a difficult issue. But over time, he had come to see it as something much more personal. He thought back to his first encounter with Emma, the woman whose story had changed everything. In many ways, she had started him on this path, a path that had led to the transformation of hundreds of thousands of lives. Her courage, her strength, and her unwavering belief in the program had sparked a fire in him. And now, watching people like Carlos rebuild their lives, Trump realized that this initiative had become more than just his legacy. It had become a movement of hope for millions of Americans. He thought of the time he had spent on the road, meeting with families in their new homes, listening to the stories of those who had been given a second chance. It was in those moments that he truly understood the power of what they had created. He had been a catalyst, yes, but it was the people themselves who had done the hard work. They were the ones who had chosen to turn their lives around. Election night arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Trump had made the homeless initiative the cornerstone of his campaign, pushing it to the forefront in every speech, every rally. The stakes were high. He needed to prove that the program was more than just a political talking point. It was a vision for the future of the country. As the results came in, it became clear that Trump's gamble had paid off. The election was a success, and his platform, now defined by his work on homelessness, had won over a larger portion of the electorate than even his most optimistic advisors had predicted. In swing states, where the program had been especially impactful, Trump gained key victories. His commitment to solving the homelessness crisis had resonated deeply with voters across the political spectrum. Standing before the crowd on election night, Trump looked out at the sea of supporters. He was victorious, but it wasn't just the political win that mattered. It was the knowledge that they had created something far more important than any election result. The weeks following the election were filled with excitement, but Trump knew that the work was far from over. The initiative was on solid footing, but it would require constant attention and adjustment. He could not afford to become complacent. Looking ahead, the focus would be on solidifying the foundation of the homeless program, ensuring that the gains made over the past year were sustainable and that the initiative could continue to grow and adapt to changing circumstances. But there was a new sense of optimism in the air. The program had sparked a national conversation about homelessness, and it had proven that change was possible. As Trump sat in the Oval Office one quiet afternoon, reflecting on the journey so far, he thought back to that first meeting with Emma. She had shown him what was possible when people were given a chance. And now, as he looked forward to the future, he knew that their work was far from finished. "This isn't just about me," Trump said to Sarah, who was sitting across the desk. "It's about all of us. Together, we've created something that can really change the country." Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the same conviction. "It's only just beginning." The air was crisp, the kind of winter morning that made everything feel fresh and full of possibility. It was the kind of day that symbolized new beginnings, a fitting metaphor for where Donald Trump found himself now. His presidency had entered its final year, and the homeless initiative, once a controversial idea, was now seen as a cornerstone of his legacy. Yet, as he sat in the Oval Office, gazing out at the White House lawn, he knew that the most important part of this journey had not been about the policies, the rallies, or the speeches. It had been about the people. The road that had led Trump here was one that few could have predicted. From the initial skepticism and backlash to the success stories now pouring in from all corners of the country, the homeless initiative had become more than a political achievement. It had become a story of transformation, both for the individuals whose lives had been changed and for Trump himself. It wasn't just about houses, jobs, or healthcare. It was about dignity. For so many Americans living in the margins, the initiative had given them not just a home, but a sense of hope and purpose. And as Trump thought back to those first few months, those tense days filled with uncertainty and doubt, he realized that the key to the program's success had been its human element. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the year, over 1 million Americans had benefited from the program in one way or another. Hundreds of thousands had transitioned out of homelessness into stable housing. Thousands of jobs had been created. Mental health services had reached those who had previously fallen through the cracks. The success was undeniable, but Trump understood that the program's true impact could not be measured in figures alone. He thought of Emma, the woman whose struggle had first captured his heart. She had been a living testament to the fact that with the right support, anyone could turn their life around. And now, as Trump prepared for his final address on the initiative, it wasn't just a speech about political victory. It was a tribute to the individuals whose courage had sparked a national movement. The final step in Trump's journey with the initiative would take him back to where it all began, the streets of Baltimore. He had promised Emma he would return, and he intended to keep that promise. It had been a year since they had met, and in that time, the city had undergone a transformation of its own. New housing projects had sprouted, revitalizing entire neighborhoods. Job training programs had flourished, and more than 10,000 people had found stable employment. But it wasn't just the buildings and the numbers that had changed. It was the spirit of the people. Trump walked down the same street where he had first met Emma, now bustling with new businesses and families. The air was filled with optimism, a stark contrast to the despair that had hung over the area when he had first visited. It was the kind of transformation that could only come from deep commitment and hard work. He arrived at the small community center where he had first met Emma. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by a crowd of familiar faces, volunteers, social workers, and former homeless individuals who had found stability through the program. But there, standing in the front, was Emma. Her transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. No longer a woman living on the streets, she was now working full-time as a counselor, helping others navigate the same path she had once struggled to walk. Her eyes, filled with hope and gratitude, met Trump's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing more to be said. Everything they had worked for had led to this moment. "Thank you, Dawn," Emma said softly. "You believed in us when no one else did. And because of that, I'm here today, helping others just like me." Trump's voice caught in his throat, a rare moment of vulnerability. "No, Emma. You did this. You made this happen." With the initiative now firmly established as a success, Trump prepared for one last public address on the issue. It would be his final message to the nation before the end of his presidency. The address was to be broadcast live, reaching millions of Americans. The White House was packed with staff, journalists, and supporters as Trump took the stage in the Rose Garden. The cameras clicked, and the crowd fell silent, waiting for him to speak. "I stand before you today not just as the President of the United States, but as a fellow American who has seen what we can accomplish when we come together," Trump began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "The homelessness crisis is not something that can be solved overnight. But over the past year, we have proven that change is possible. We've proven that when we give people the tools they need, housing, healthcare, jobs, and, most importantly, hope, we can change lives." He paused, looking out over the audience, his eyes lingering on the faces of people who had once been homeless and were now standing with him, their lives transformed. This is not just about politics. This is about people. This is about all of us, working together to build a stronger, more compassionate nation. And we have only just begun. The audience erupted into applause, and Trump felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This wasn't just a victory for his administration. It was a victory for America. As the final months of his presidency ticked down, Trump continued to push for more funding, more partnerships, and more opportunities to expand the initiative. He knew that the fight wasn't over, and that even after he left office, the work would continue. But what he had accomplished in those few short years was more than he had ever dreamed possible. The homeless initiative would be his legacy, not just because it was successful, but because it had changed the way America saw itself. It was a testament to the power of compassion and perseverance, and it had started with a simple, powerful idea that every life mattered. As Trump sat in the quiet of the Oval Office on his last day in office, he reflected on his journey, from the man he had once been to the man who now understood what it meant to truly lead. He thought back to the cold, lonely streets of Baltimore, to the faces of those who had inspired him, and to the moment when he had made the decision to take a chance on a program that no one thought would succeed. In that moment, Trump understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. Leadership wasn't about winning elections or scoring political points. It was about making a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. And as he left the White House for the final time, he knew that he had done just that. The journey had been long. The struggles had been real. But in the end, it had all been worth it. For the people of America and for himself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?